Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, a quiet place where old stories are allowed to unfold slowly, where speculation is treated gently, and where history, myth and possibility are given room to breathe. Tonight's journey is not one of distant stars or vanished worlds alone, but of proximity, of closeness, of the unsettling idea that something extraordinary may not have needed to arrive dramatically or depart loudly to shape the human story. Instead, it may have stayed, it may have walked, it may have lived beside us unnoticed, unrecorded in any official sense, yet remembered in fragments that refuse to fully fade. This story centers on the Anunnaki, figures known from ancient Mesopotamian texts, beings described as powerful, knowledgeable, and deeply involved in humanity's earlier civilizations. Over time, they became gods, symbols, metaphors, or myths, depending on who was telling the story and when. But here, we are not rushing to conclusions, and we are not declaring certainty. We are doing something quieter. We are exploring how such beings, if they existed as something more than symbolic deities, could have lived among humans without being seen for what they truly were, not through invisibility or magic, but through familiarity, through patience, through understanding human perception better than humans understood themselves. If you find this calm exploration soothing, or if the slow unfolding of ancient possibilities brings you a sense of comfort as the day winds down, a gentle like or subscription helps this small corner of quiet reach others who may be looking for the same stillness. Nothing urgent, nothing demanding, just a simple gesture that keeps these long, unhurried stories alive. Now allow the pace to soften. There is no need to hold on to every detail. The ideas will circle back in their own time. This is not a tale of sudden revelations. It is a gradual settling into a possibility that grows less strange the longer it is considered. To imagine how the Anunnaki could have lived among humans unnoticed, it helps first to step away from modern assumptions. Today, the idea of an advanced, non-human intelligence living beside us immediately conjures images of technology, glowing devices, sharp divisions between species, and an expectation of visible difference. But the ancient world did not operate on those terms. Early human societies were small, fragmented, and deeply shaped by oral tradition. Identity was local, knowledge was uneven. Record-keeping was rare, symbolic, and often restricted to priestly classes. In such a world, difference did not automatically signal otherness. A person who lived longer than expected, who knew how to read the sky, who understood agriculture before others did, or who spoke with unusual authority would not necessarily be labelled non-human. They would be called wise, or favoured, or touched by the gods. The category of god itself was flexible, overlapping comfortably with kingship, ancestry and myth. To live among humans, the Anunnaki would not have needed to hide. They would only have needed to fit within existing human explanations. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe the Anunnaki not as distant, abstract forces, but as beings who interacted directly with humanity. They taught, commanded, punished, negotiated, and governed. They lived in cities. They held councils. They divided responsibilities. These are not the actions of unknowable cosmic entities removed from daily life. They are the behaviours of administrators, rulers, and overseers. If such beings existed in a physical sense, their integration into early human society would have followed patterns already familiar to us from human history itself. Throughout history, small ruling classes have lived among much larger populations while remaining fundamentally separate. Elites have always known how to blend visibility with distance. They appear during rituals, decisions, or moments of crisis, then retreat into spaces others cannot access. Palaces, temples, and restricted compounds are not merely architectural choices, they are social technologies. They allow presence without intimacy, authority without explanation. The Anunnaki, as described, occupied precisely this role. They were present but elevated, known but not fully understood, seen often enough to be accepted, yet distant enough to avoid scrutiny. In such a structure, the question of being noticed does not arise. Power itself becomes the explanation. There is also the matter of time. Human lifespans in the ancient world were short, unpredictable, and shaped by disease, injury, and scarcity. Generational memory rarely extended beyond a few living elders. If a being lived significantly longer than a human, they would not be perceived as ageless. They would simply persist across generations while human observers changed. A figure remembered as a god by one generation could be remembered as a legendary ancestor by the next, and as a symbol by the next after that. Longevity alone dissolves clarity. Ancient king lists, particularly the Sumerian king list, record reigns lasting tens of thousands of years before a great flood divides history into a more familiar scale. These numbers are often dismissed as symbolic, but they may reflect something else. A memory of continuity, a sense that leadership did not change as quickly as a human experience suggested it should. When the same guiding presence appears again and again in different eras, human storytelling stretches time to accommodate the anomaly. Blending in would also not require constant proximity. Living among humans does not mean sharing every aspect of daily life. It means existing within the same world, influencing systems rather than individuals. Teaching agriculture does not require standing in every field. Establishing law does not require attending every dispute. Once systems are in place, they self-perpetuate. Guidance becomes tradition. Instruction becomes culture. The Anunnaki, in this framing, would not need to remain visibly active. Withdrawal is not disappearance. Silence is not absence. A reduced presence can be mistaken for departure, even while influence continues quietly beneath the surface. Human history is filled with founders who vanish from records while their systems remain intact for centuries. Language also plays a role. If the Anunnaki possessed advanced knowledge, their greatest advantage would not be superior tools, but superior understanding of communication. Knowing what not to say is often more powerful than speaking openly. By embedding knowledge within myth, ritual, and symbolic language, they could ensure transmission without exposure. Myths are resilient precisely because they are not literal. They survive reinterpretation. They adapt. They protect information by disguising it as story. Living among humans would also mean understanding fear. Sudden revelation destabilizes societies. Even human leaders who change too quickly or disrupt tradition too forcefully often face resistance or collapse. An advanced presence would quickly learn that survival depends on subtlety. Gradual influence avoids panic. Familiar forms prevent revolt. Becoming part of the background is safer than standing apart. There is also the simple reality that humans are not especially good at noticing what they are accustomed to. Familiarity dulls attention. A figure present from childhood becomes part of the mental furniture of life. When something has always been there, it stops being examined. This is not a weakness unique to ancient people. It remains true today. The most influential systems in modern life are often the least questioned because they feel normal. If the Anunnaki lived among humans, they would not need advanced concealment. They would need patience. They would need restraint. They would need to let humans explain them away in ways that felt comfortable. Gods, ancestors, kings, spirits, symbols. All of these labels serve the same function. They make the unfamiliar manageable. Over time, direct presence could fade into memory. As populations grew, as cities expanded, as writing replaced oral tradition, the old explanations would harden into myth. What was once seen would become something that was said to have been seen. What was once lived would become something remembered, and eventually something doubted. This transition does not require a dramatic departure. It requires only time and human reinterpretation. When knowledge becomes tradition, the teacher is no longer needed. When systems become self-sustaining, the architect can step away. Influence does not vanish, simply becomes invisible. As this idea settles, the Anunnaki no longer appear as hidden figures crouching in shadows or disguising themselves in human skin. They become something quieter and more plausible. administrators of the early civilization who understood when to lead and when to withdraw, observers who recognized that remaining unseen is often a consequence of being deeply integrated rather than completely absent. From here, the story naturally moves backward rather than forward. To understand how such integration could occur, it becomes necessary to look at the earliest moments when humans first began telling stories of watchers, teachers, and beings who were present before history had a name for itself. That path leads not towards spectacle, but toward memory, and toward the subtle beginnings of a long coexistence that may never have announced itself at all. Long before the idea of disappearance carried any sense of loss or mystery, before absence implied departure, early human stories spoke instead of presence that was intermittent, selective, and unexplained. In the oldest layers of myth and memory, beings did not arrive and leave in neat sequences. They appeared, withdrew, returned, and lingered at the edges of awareness. The concept of something being gone forever had little meaning in a world where cycles governed everything, where seasons returned, stars reappeared, and ancestors were believed to remain close, just beyond sight. In such a mental landscape, the idea that powerful visitors might step back without vanishing entirely felt natural rather than alarming. The earlier stories that later cultures would interpret as encounters with gods or spirits often describe beings who were not fully separate from the human world. They walked on the same ground, ate similar food, formed unions, argued, taught, and imposed rules. These were not distant abstractions. They were characters embedded in social life. Their presence was not framed as an invasion or an interruption, but as part of how the world functioned before things became more rigid, more ordered, and more strictly human. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki are introduced not as strangers descending from the sky in dramatic fashion, but as established figures within a cosmic hierarchy that mirrors human governance. They hold councils, they divide labour, they assign oversight of natural forces and human institutions. This structure feels familiar because it is familiar. It reflects how early city-states operated, with ruling elites whose authority was justified by lineage, tradition, and proximity to sacred knowledge. If such beings lived among humans, their earliest appearances would not have been recorded as rivals. They would have been remembered simply as those who were already there. The oldest myths rarely concern first contact. Instead, they concern regulation. They explain why humans must work, why death exists, why order must be maintained, and why boundaries cannot be crossed. These are not the concerns of a species encountering the unknown for the first time. They are the concerns of a society adjusting to a new structure of authority. Hidden visitors, in this context, are not hidden because they are unseen, but because their origins are no longer questioned. Their presence becomes part of the assumed background of reality. Many early stories describe a time when the world was closer, more fluid, and less divided. The boundary between gods and humans was permeable. Interaction was common. Over time, that boundary hardened. The stories shift from direct encounters to distant worship. The beings who once walked openly now dwell elsewhere. Mountains, heavens, underworlds, sacred enclosures. This change is often interpreted as mythological evolution, but it can also be read as a social memory of withdrawal rather than disappearance. Withdrawal is quieter than departure. It does not announce itself. It does not demand explanation. It allows those remaining to fill the gap with meaning. When authority steps back gradually, it becomes tradition rather than presence. The earlier stories of hidden visitors reflect this process. They do not dwell on shock or confusion. They accept absence as part of an ongoing relationship rather than an ending. In many ancient cultures, there are recurring motifs of teachers who arrive before humanity is ready, impart knowledge, and then recede. They are remembered as culture heroes, lawgivers, or divine messengers. In Mesoamerica, figures like Quetzalcoatl are described as civilizers who promise to return. In the Near East, Apkallu sages emerge from the waters to instruct humanity before retreating. In Egypt, the gods rule directly in a primordial age before handing power to human kings. Across continents, the pattern is consistent. Presence precedes history. Withdrawal precedes memory. These stories do not emphasize concealment. They emphasize timing. The visitors are present when needed and absent when their role is complete. This framing suggests that being unseen later was not a failure of perception, but an intentional shift in relationship. The hiddenness is not about avoiding detection. It is about redefining interaction. Early humans did not document reality as modern observers do. Oral tradition prioritized meaning over detail. Stories were shaped by repetition, symbolism, and social relevance. When a powerful being stopped appearing regularly, the reason mattered less than the effect. The absence itself became meaningful. It marked a transition from guidance to responsibility, from dependence to autonomy. In such a context, hidden visitors are not erased. They are transformed. There is also the matter of scale. Early human groups were small. Encounters, whether with unusual individuals or advanced beings, would be localized. A presence known to one city or region would not automatically be known elsewhere. Stories spread slowly and changed as they traveled. Over generations, details blurred, names shifted, roles merged. What began as a specific memory could become a generalized myth. This process does not require deception. It requires time. When information moves through oral culture, precision is less important than coherence. A being remembered as a teacher in one era may become a god in another, and a symbol in the next. The original nature of the visitor is not hidden deliberately. It is simply no longer relevant to the needs of the story. Hiddenness, in this sense, is an emergent property of memory rather than an active strategy. The Anunnaki, if present among early humans, would not need to cloak themselves in secrecy. They would only need to allow human storytelling to do what it always does: simplify, elevate, abstract. Over time, the concrete becomes symbolic. The literal becomes sacred. The earlier stories also reveal a discomfort with too much proximity. Myths frequently describe moments when boundaries are violated, when gods interfere too directly, or when humans gain forbidden knowledge. These moments are followed by consequences: floods, exile, division. The lesson is clear. Too much closeness destabilizes the world. Balance requires distance. This narrative pattern may preserve a collective understanding that continued overt presence was unsustainable. If advanced beings lived among humans, they would quickly recognize this dynamic. Stability depends on predictability. Reverence depends on distance. Authority erodes when familiarity becomes too intimate. By stepping back, by becoming less visible, they preserve both influence and order. Hiddenness becomes a form of governance rather than avoidance. The language of early myths supports this interpretation. Terms translated as heaven or sky often mean separation rather than altitude. The gods do not necessarily leave the world, they relocate within it. Sacred spaces are set apart, not removed. Temples are thresholds, mountains are boundaries. The divine remains near, but not accessible. This is not disappearance, it is containment. Even the concept of death among the gods is ambiguous. Some texts describe gods who die and return. Others describe sleep, withdrawal, or confinement. These are not endings, they are pauses, states of reduced interaction. A being that enters such a state is not gone. It is simply unavailable. This aligns closely with the idea of hidden visitors who remain present in a broader sense while stepping out of daily life. Archaeological evidence adds another layer of quiet suggestion. Sudden leaps in social complexity, architecture, and organization appear without clear transitional phases. While mainstream explanations focus on human ingenuity and gradual accumulation of knowledge, the myths remember something else: They remember instruction, guidance, templates handed down rather than invented. When those templates are complete, the instructors fade from view. The fading itself becomes mythologized. Stories speak of ages, golden ages, times when gods walked among humans. These ages end not with catastrophe alone, but with separation. Humans are left to govern themselves, the gods retreat. This framing preserves the memory of presence without demanding its continuation. In this light, the earlier stories of hidden visitors are not about beings who vanished mysteriously. They're about beings who stepped aside. The distinction matters. Vanishing invites suspicion. Stepping aside invites reverence. One implies failure, the other implies intention. As human societies grew larger and more complex, direct interaction would become increasingly impractical. Visibility invites challenge. Challenge invites conflict. For an advanced presence invested in long-term outcomes, invisibility through integration and withdrawal would be the safest path. Over generations, their continued existence would be assumed by some, doubted by others, and symbolized by most. The idea that they were hidden rather than gone would not emerge immediately. It would surface later when humans began to look back and notice gaps. Why did the gods stop appearing? Why did the voices fall silent? Why did the age of wonders end? These questions only arise once absence is felt as loss rather than transition. The earlier stories do not ask these questions. They accept change without protest. That acceptance suggests familiarity with cycles of presence and withdrawal. Hidden visitors are not anomalies. They are part of the rhythm of early understanding. As time moves forward, these rhythms harden into doctrine. The gods are placed firmly elsewhere. The past becomes unreachable. The stories lose their ambiguity. But beneath that later certainty lies an older memory, one that does not insist the visitors left, only that they stopped being seen in the same way. From this foundation, the idea of the Anunnaki living among humans without being seen begins to feel less extraordinary. It becomes an extension of how early humans already understood authority, knowledge, and absence. Not everything unseen is gone. Not everything remembered was ever fully understood. As human history continues to unfold, the next layer of this story shifts from memory to strategy, from myth to method. Because if such beings once shared the world openly, the question is no longer why they disappeared, but how they could remain close while allowing humanity to believe they were no longer there at all. For a very long time, the dominant image of the Anunnaki has been one of height and distance. They are imagined above the clouds, descending from the heavens and departing back into the sky once their work was complete. This image feels natural to a modern audience because we associate advanced beings with spacecraft, orbit, and separation from the surface of the Earth. Yet when the oldest sources are examined closely, something quieter and more grounded emerges. The Anunnaki are not consistently described as beings who belonged elsewhere. They are described as beings who are here, embedded in the structure of the world itself, operating from within rather than ruling from above. The idea that they left Earth entirely is a later interpretation layered onto earlier traditions. In the earliest texts, the language of ascent and descent is often symbolic, reflecting hierarchy, authority, and separation of roles rather than literal physical departure. When gods are said to dwell in the sky, it does not always mean they occupied a different planet or dimension. It often means they were inaccessible, elevated in status, removed from ordinary life. Kings lived above commoners without leaving the city. Priests stood closer to the divine without floating away from the ground. Elevation was social before it was spatial. If the Anunnaki existed as advanced beings who interacted directly with early humans, leaving Earth would not necessarily be the logical conclusion of their story. Departure creates risk. It leaves systems unattended. It allows memory to drift. It invites reinterpretation. Remaining close, even if no longer visible, preserves continuity and oversight. from the perspective of long-term stability, staying embedded within the environment they had already shaped would make far more sense than abandoning it entirely. Ancient Mesopotamian cosmology reflects this embeddedness. The world is not divided into neat layers of sky and earth as separate realms. It is a continuum. The heavens, the land, and the underworld are interconnected spaces, each with guardians, administrators, and points of access. The Anunnaki occupy roles across this spectrum. Some are associated with the sky, others with water, earth, fertility, law, or death. They are not a single group waiting above the atmosphere. They are distributed throughout the structure of reality as it was understood. This distribution suggests presence rather than absence. It suggests a system in which authority is localized, not centralized elsewhere. If the Anunnaki were managing aspects of early civilization, agriculture, resource extraction, and social order, removing themselves physically would undermine their own influence. A system designed to run indefinitely would require ongoing maintenance, even if that maintenance became subtle over time. There is also the practical question of observation. Early humans had no concept of space travel as we understand it today. Their language for describing the unknown relied on familiar metaphors. The sky was vast, unreachable, and mysterious. To place powerful beings, there was not a scientific statement. It was a narrative shorthand. The same applies to mountains, oceans, and the underworld. These were not separate worlds. They were thresholds, places where ordinary life gave way to something beyond immediate human control. When later cultures reinterpreted these metaphors through modern lenses, the idea of literal departure took hold. Gods became aliens. Heavens became outer space. Ascent became launch. But this transformation says more about modern imagination than ancient intent. The original stories rarely emphasize a final goodbye. They emphasize reduced interaction, silence, distance, separation of roles. These are social shifts, not evacuations. If the Anunnaki remained on Earth, their continued presence would not need to be dramatic. It would likely be static, localized, and deeply integrated. They would not roam openly among large populations as societies grew more complex. Instead, they would withdraw into controlled environments, restricted regions, sacred zones, isolated compounds, areas designated as forbidden or divine. Human history is filled with places set aside for reasons no longer remembered. Sacred groves, no-go mountains, ruins avoided by tradition rather than logic. Such spaces do not need to conceal advanced beings actively. They only need to be culturally protected. Once a place is labelled dangerous, holy, or cursed, people avoid it willingly. The need for guards disappears. The belief enforces itself. This is one of the most efficient methods of long-term concealment ever developed, and humans have used it repeatedly without understanding why it works so well. Remaining on Earth would also allow the Anunnaki to adapt alongside humanity. Leaving freezes perspective. Staying permits observation. Over thousands of years, human societies changed dramatically. Languages evolved. Political structures shifted. Technologies emerged independently. An advanced presence interested in long-term outcomes would benefit from witnessing these changes firsthand, rather than monitoring them from a distance. Adaptation does not require constant interference. In fact, too much intervention destabilizes development. The most effective form of influence is indirect. Establish principles, introduce frameworks, then step back and allow the system to evolve. If corrections are needed, they can be subtle. A nudge here, a collapse allowed there. History already reflects such patterns. Sudden rises and falls that appear internal but may be responses to unseen pressures. The idea that the Anunnaki left Earth also assumes a clear boundary between them and humans. Yet ancient stories repeatedly blur that boundary. Unions between gods and humans produce offspring. Kings claim divine ancestry. Bloodlines are traced back to heavenly figures. These are not metaphors of distance. They are metaphors of continuity. They suggest overlap rather than separation. If such intermingling occurred, departure becomes even less likely. Leaving behind descendants, hybrid populations, or embedded genetic traits creates a lingering presence that cannot simply be abandoned. Influence continues biologically as well as culturally. Staying nearby would allow monitoring of these lineages and outcomes without drawing attention. There is also the question of motivation. Why would the Anunnaki leave at all? Common explanations suggest resource depletion, conflict, or completion of a project. Yet none of these require total departure. Resources can be managed. Conflicts can be contained. Projects can transition to maintenance phases. Human history demonstrates that abandonment is rarely the preferred solution for invested powers. Control is relinquished slowly, if at all. Many myths describe a moment when the gods grow tired of humanity, disturbed by noise, conflict, or overpopulation. The response is not departure, it is regulation. Floods, plagues, reset mechanisms. These stories imply continued involvement. Frustration does not lead to abandonment. It leads to restructuring. If the Anunnaki chose to reduce visibility, doing so while remaining on Earth would be the safest option. Leaving introduces uncertainty. It allows humanity to reinterpret the past freely. Staying allows quiet correction if narratives drift too far from reality. Myth can be guided gently when the source remains present, even if unseen. From a biological standpoint, Earth is already optimized for human life. Any beings adapted to live here alongside early humans would face fewer challenges remaining than relocating permanently. Evolutionary adaptation favors stability. A species capable of thriving on Earth would have little incentive to abandon it completely unless forced. Geography also supports the idea of continued presence. There are vast regions of Earth that remain difficult to access even today. Dense jungles, polar regions, deep subterranean networks, isolated islands, remote deserts. In the ancient world, these areas were effectively unreachable. They provided natural concealment without requiring advanced technology. Occupying such regions would allow isolation without isolation from the planet itself. Some traditions speak of gods retreating to mountains, depths, or distant lands rather than leaving the world entirely. These retreats are framed as separations from humanity, not from Earth. The distinction is subtle but important. Withdrawal from society does not equal departure from the environment. As civilizations grew more crowded and interconnected, maintaining a low profile would become increasingly important. Remaining within human centers would risk exposure. Retreating to the margins would reduce that risk. Over time, even memory of these retreats would fade. Places once associated with divine presence would become legendary, then symbolic, then forgotten. This process does not require secrecy in the modern sense. It relies on the natural erosion of attention. Humans focus on what affects their daily survival. Anything that does not demand interaction eventually slips from conscious awareness. A hidden presence that does not interfere becomes effectively invisible. The persistence of ancient architectural mysteries also supports this framing. Structures that appear suddenly with no clear developmental lineage suggest moments of intense guidance followed by long periods of absence. The builders remain. The teachers vanish. Or rather, they stop participating openly. The knowledge persists without its source. If the Anunnaki never truly left Earth, then the silence that follows their active involvement is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of a completed phase. Human societies were no longer in need of overt instruction. Systems were in place. Traditions had taken root. Continued visibility would hinder independence. Seen this way, the idea of departure is a misunderstanding born from later storytelling habits. Humans expect beginnings and endings, arrivals and exits. But long-term systems rarely operate that way. They transition, they fade, they settle into the background. Remaining on Earth would also explain why stories of the Anunnaki never fully disappear. They resurface repeatedly in different forms, cultures, and eras. If the source were entirely gone, memory would decay more completely. Instead, it lingers, reshaped but persistent, as if continually refreshed by something just out of reach. This does not require ongoing interaction. It requires proximity, presence without participation, observation without interference, a stance that aligns with patience rather than dominance. As the idea settles, the image of the Anunnaki shifts. They are no longer imagined as skybound visitors who came and went. They become something more unsettling and more plausible. Long-term residents who learned when to be visible and when to withdraw. Beings who did not leave Earth, but learned how to remain without being noticed. From here, the story naturally moves toward method rather than location. Because if they stayed, the next question is not where they went, but how they could exist alongside humans while blending so thoroughly that their presence became indistinguishable from myth, authority, and memory itself. To imagine advanced beings living among humans without being noticed, it helps to abandon the modern expectation that difference must be obvious. We are accustomed to thinking that advancement announces itself through visible technology, dramatic abilities, or physical traits that cannot be ignored. But history suggests the opposite. The most influential forces are often those that appear unremarkable. They move quietly, adopt local norms, and avoid drawing attention precisely because attention invites scrutiny. Blending in is not about disguise in the theatrical sense. It is about understanding context deeply enough that no disguise is needed at all. If the Anunnaki possessed knowledge or capabilities beyond early humans, their greatest advantage would not have been superiority, but restraint. Appearing ordinary would not require them to lower themselves. It would require them to understand what humans consider normal and to remain comfortably within those boundaries. Normality is not fixed. It is shaped by culture, expectation, and repetition. What feels extraordinary to one generation can feel mundane to the next, if it is introduced gradually and framed correctly. In early human societies, variation was common and poorly documented. Differences in height, strength, health, lifespan, intelligence, or skill were explained through fate, ancestry, divine favour, or simple luck. There was no standardized baseline against which to measure deviation. In such an environment, an advanced being would not stand out simply by being capable. They would stand out only if they violated social expectations. Avoiding that would be far easier than it seems. Blending in begins with behavior rather than appearance. Humans notice those who act differently long before they notice those who look different. Speech patterns, social rhythms, emotional responses, and adherence to custom matter more than physical traits. An advanced being who mastered local language, gesture, etiquette, and social hierarchy would pass unnoticed even if subtle differences existed. Humans are remarkably forgiving of anomalies when behavior aligns with expectation. There is also the matter of role selection. Certain roles within society naturally accommodate difference. Priests, scribes, healers, advisors, and administrators are expected to possess unusual knowledge. Their authority rests on expertise that others do not share. When such individuals demonstrate insight beyond common understanding, it reinforces their role rather than challenging it. The extraordinary becomes justified by position. The Anunnaki, as described in ancient texts, are repeatedly associated with governance, law, measurement, agriculture, and ritual. These are domains where precision and foresight are valued. An individual who excels in these areas would not be questioned for being too capable. They would be respected. The boundary between advanced knowledge and divine wisdom is thin in pre-scientific societies. Excellence does not provoke investigation. It provokes reverence. Physical blending would also be easier than often assumed. Ancient populations were genetically diverse, shaped by migration, intermarriage, and environmental pressures. Variations in skin tone, facial structure, and body type existed without formal classification. Without modern genetics or global comparison, no single appearance defined humanity. An advanced being whose physiology overlapped even partially with humans would not appear alien. They would appear unusual at most, and even that would fade with familiarity. Clothing, adornment, and grooming further blur distinctions. Humans have always used external markers to signal identity. By adopting local dress and customs, any physical differences would be contextualized rather than highlighted. Uniformity creates invisibility. Those who dress, speak, and behave as expected rarely attract sustained attention. Time also plays a critical role. Blending in is not instantaneous. It is achieved through consistency. A presence that remains stable over years becomes part of the social landscape. Even if something seems unusual at first, repetition normalizes it. Humans are pattern-driven. Once a pattern is established, it resists re-evaluation. A figure who has always been present is rarely questioned. Longevity, often cited as a giveaway of non-human origin, could be concealed through strategy rather than deception. Public roles can change. Names can shift, lineages can be emphasized. A long-lived being does not need to appear unchanged across centuries. They need only ensure that continuity is explained through succession rather than persistence. Humans already understand inheritance. A father becomes a son, a teacher becomes a school. Identity dissolves into institution. In societies where written records were sparse or controlled, tracking individuals across generations was nearly impossible. Oral memory compresses time, stories blend people together, names repeat, events overlap. A presence that persists quietly can be remembered as a series of related figures rather than a single enduring one. This does not require falsification. It is how memory naturally operates. Advanced beings would also understand the value of limitation. Displaying full capability is unnecessary and counterproductive. Humans react poorly to overwhelming superiority. It destabilizes social order and invites fear. By operating within known constraints, an advanced presence maintains trust. Tools can be introduced gradually. Knowledge can be framed as rediscovery rather than innovation. Progress appears organic rather than imposed. This pattern appears repeatedly in myth. Knowledge is said to be remembered, revealed, or restored, not invented. The implication is that humans are reclaiming something lost rather than receiving something new. This framing preserves dignity and reduces resistance. It allows guidance without domination. Blending in also involves emotional alignment. Humans are attuned to emotional cues. A being that responds appropriately to joy, grief, anger, and fear will be perceived as empathetic and trustworthy. Emotional mismatch is more unsettling than intellectual difference. An advanced being that understands human psychology would prioritize emotional fluency above all else. Silence is another critical tool. Speaking less reduces risk. Observing more increases understanding. Many myths describe gods who watch rather than act, who listen before intervening. This posture aligns with blending rather than control. Presence without intrusion becomes background rather than foreground. There is also the advantage of social fragmentation. Early human societies were divided by geography, language, and tradition. A presence known in one region would not necessarily be known elsewhere. This compartmentalization limits exposure. Knowledge remains localized. Even if suspicion arises in one place, it does not spread easily. When blending is successful, it eventually becomes self-sustaining. Humans explain away anomalies on behalf of the hidden presence. They create stories, rituals, and hierarchies that protect the status quo. Questioning becomes taboo. Curiosity is redirected. The presence no longer needs to act. It is shielded by belief. The Anunnaki myths often emphasize law and order. These are stabilizing forces. By embedding themselves within legal and ritual frameworks, Advanced beings ensure predictability. Systems replace individuals. Authority becomes abstract. Once this transition occurs, personal presence is no longer required. There is also the possibility of deliberate obscurity. Avoiding fame is easier than managing it. A being who refuses titles, avoids monuments, and discourages direct worship remains diffuse. Influence without a focal point is harder to challenge. Power spreads thinly and becomes invisible. As societies evolve, blending strategies would evolve with them. What works in a village does not work in a city. What works in a city does not work in an empire. Visibility must decrease as population increases. Distance must grow as communication improves. An advanced presence that adapts its level of engagement over time can remain unnoticed indefinitely. This adaptability may explain why later myths speak of gods becoming distant. The distance is not physical, it is social. As humans develop institutions capable of self-governance, direct involvement becomes unnecessary and risky. Withdrawal preserves stability. Blending in also benefits from human bias. Humans tend to look upward for explanations. When something exceeds understanding, it is placed beyond reach. The sky, the heavens, the divine realm. This habit directs attention away from the immediate environment. If something extraordinary exists nearby, it is often overlooked because it does not fit the expected direction of wonder. In this way, the Anunnaki would not need to hide behind advanced camouflage or deception. They would hide in plain sight, protected by expectation itself. Humans rarely suspect what feels familiar. They rarely question what has always been there. Over time, blending becomes erasure, not because the presence vanishes, but because the category for recognizing it disappears. What was once a being becomes a role. What was once a teacher becomes a tradition. What was once an observer becomes a myth. Yet myths are not inventions. They are compressions. They preserve structure while losing detail. When the details fade, the structure remains. The persistence of Anunnaki-like figures across cultures suggests a shared memory that has been reshaped rather than discarded. Blending in, then, is not a trick. It is long-term strategy grounded in patience, understanding, and respect for human psychology. It requires knowing when to act and when to remain still, when to speak, and when to allow stories to speak instead. If advanced beings mastered this art, their presence would not feel invasive or threatening. It would feel natural, ordinary, so ordinary that it would eventually become invisible. From this point, the idea of hidden coexistence no longer feels extraordinary. It feels inevitable. And once beings have learned how to appear ordinary, the next layer of the story shifts from individuals to environments. Because blending in does not only happen through people, it happens through places, routines, and cities themselves, where anonymity becomes not just possible, but guaranteed. As human societies began to settle, cluster, and grow into permanent communities, something subtle but transformative occurred. The world became busier, denser, more layered. With that density came a new kind of invisibility, one not created by distance or secrecy, but by proximity itself. Cities, even in their earliest forms, are engines of distraction. They generate noise, routine, hierarchy, and repetition. They pull attention outward and fragment it. In doing so, they create ideal conditions for anything or anyone who wishes to remain present without being noticed. If the Anunnaki sought a way to coexist with humans while gradually reducing visibility, early cities would have offered the perfect solution. Not because cities hide things physically, but because they overwhelm perception. In a settlement where hundreds or thousands of people interact daily, individual anomalies blur into the background. Patterns matter more than particulars. Systems replace faces. Authority becomes procedural rather than personal. This shift fundamentally changes how presence is perceived. Early cities like Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and later Babylon were not chaotic sprawl in the modern sense, but they were complex enough to dilute attention. They introduced specialization: farmers, builders, scribes, priests, merchants, guards. Each role came with expectations and limits. When responsibility is divided, no single individual is expected to understand the whole. This fragmentation of awareness creates gaps, and gaps are where unnoticed presence thrives. Living within a city does not require standing out. It requires fitting into a function. A person who fulfills a role efficiently is rarely questioned. A scribe who records, a priest who oversees ritual, an administrator who allocates resources. These positions grant access without exposure. They allow movement through spaces others cannot enter while remaining unremarkable in daily life. Authority becomes embedded in office rather than personality. For advanced beings, cities would provide camouflage through bureaucracy. Once rules and procedures are established, they enforce themselves. Decisions appear to come from the system rather than from individuals. Influence becomes diffuse. Responsibility becomes abstract. This is one of the most powerful forms of concealment ever developed, and it emerges naturally in urban environments. Cities also create layers of sacred and restricted space: temples, storehouses, archives, inner courts. Access is controlled not by force, but by tradition and permission. Humans internalize these boundaries quickly. A place labelled sacred or administrative becomes invisible to those without reason to enter it. What happens inside is accepted rather than questioned. The fewer people who witness something, the fewer who can describe it. Ancient temples were not merely religious centres. They were economic hubs, educational institutions, and political headquarters. They stored surplus grain, managed labour, recorded transactions, and legitimised authority. A presence embedded within such institutions would not need to justify itself. It would be protected by the sanctity of the structure itself. Questioning the institution would feel like questioning the order of the world. The Anunnaki, as described in Mesopotamian texts, are deeply tied to temple culture. They are patrons of cities, owners of land, overseers of law. This association suggests not an external presence hovering above settlements, but an internal one woven into their operation. A god of a city does not need to appear in the streets daily. Their influence is felt through governance, ritual, and continuity. Cities also accelerate normalization. In a small village, everyone knows everyone. Change is noticed immediately. In a city, anonymity becomes possible. Individuals pass each other without recognition. Faces blur. Memory shortens. A being who appears slightly unusual would be absorbed into the crowd. Repetition erodes curiosity. What is seen every day stops being seen at all. Time functions differently in cities as well. Daily cycles become structured by labour, ritual, and administration, rather than by the natural environment alone. Bells, calls, schedules, and calendars replace direct observation of the sky. This abstraction of time further distances people from noticing anomalies. Attention shifts from presence to process, from who is there to what needs to be done. Urban life also produces records, but records are selective. Writing in early cities was controlled by elites and focused on what mattered to governance: taxes, offerings, trade, lineage. Anything outside these categories was rarely documented. A presence that did not disrupt economic or political order would leave little trace. Silence in the record does not imply absence. It implies irrelevance to administrative priorities. There is also the psychological effect of authority within cities. When power is centralized, people assume someone is in charge. They do not need to know who. The sense that order exists reduces the impulse to question its source. If things function, curiosity fades. A hidden presence benefits from stability more than secrecy. Cities further allow for compartmentalization of knowledge. Not everyone knows everything. A priest knows ritual. A scribe knows writing. A builder knows stone. Knowledge silos prevent holistic understanding. An advanced being could move between these silos, sharing limited information where needed without revealing the full picture to anyone. Fragmented knowledge protects the whole. In such an environment, influence can be exerted indirectly. Laws can be shaped, calendars adjusted, measurements standardized. These changes affect daily life profoundly without ever revealing their origin. Once codified, they persist independently of their creator. The city carries the influence forward even if the influencer steps back. The physical layout of cities also aids concealment. Dense construction, narrow streets, inner courtyards. Visibility is limited. Movement is constrained. Observation is partial. Unlike open landscapes where presence is obvious, urban environments naturally obscure lines of sight. What happens behind walls is accepted as private or institutional. Privacy becomes a cultural norm. Cities also generate noise, both literal and metaphorical. Sounds of labour, animals, markets, ritual. Noise masks anomalies. It makes quiet presence harder to detect. In such settings, only disruption draws attention. Stillness goes unnoticed. As cities grew into empires, this effect intensified. Scale overwhelms memory. No one can track all actors. Authority becomes symbolic. The gods are represented by statues, standards, and rituals rather than by living figures. This transition allows the original presence to withdraw further, without being perceived as absent. Representation replaces embodiment. If the Anunnaki lived within early cities, their gradual retreat from public visibility would feel like a natural evolution rather than a disappearance. The city would continue to function. Rituals would continue. Laws would be enforced. The system would appear intact. Humans would assume the gods remained involved because the structure they were associated with still operated. This assumption is powerful. Humans tend to attribute continuity to ongoing oversight, even when none is visible. The idea that a system persists without guidance is uncomfortable. It suggests vulnerability, so the belief in hidden supervision persists long after direct evidence fades. Cities also provide plausible deniability. If rumours arise of unusual figures or unexplained authority, they can be dismissed as exaggeration, misunderstanding, or local myth. Urban populations are accustomed to stories. They circulate and fade. Without a shared frame of reference, nothing solidifies. Archaeological layers reinforce this interpretation. Cities are built atop cities. Foundations are buried. Structures are repurposed. Original functions are forgotten. What was once central becomes hidden beneath later development. Physical concealment occurs not through secrecy, but through accumulation. Time itself becomes camouflage. This layering mirrors cultural memory. Stories are built atop stories, meanings shift, origins blur. The earliest presence becomes inaccessible not because it is removed, but because it is covered by what came after. To uncover it requires excavation, literal or intellectual. If the Anunnaki remained within urban centres during humanity's formative periods, their influence would be deepest precisely where they were least visible. The city would become their mask, a living, evolving structure that carries intent forward without needing a visible actor. As writing, law, and governance became human-controlled, the need for visible guidance diminished. The Anunnaki could withdraw further, allowing humans to take ownership of systems already shaped by earlier instruction. The city would appear fully human, even if its foundations were not. This transition aligns with mythological narratives of gods retreating from direct rule while leaving kings in charge. Divine authority becomes legitimizing rather than operational. The gods endorse rather than administer. Over time, even that endorsement becomes symbolic. Cities thus serve not only as places of human gathering, but as buffers between presence and perception. They absorb, diffuse, and normalize. They allow coexistence without confrontation. Living within them does not require concealment. It requires patience. As this layer of the story settles, the Anunnaki no longer appear as hidden figures lurking at the margins. They become something more integrated and more difficult to isolate, a presence folded into the very structures that define civilization. From here, the question naturally shifts again, because living unnoticed within cities solves the problem of visibility, but it introduces another challenge. Time. Human lives are short. Cities endure longer, but not forever. To remain embedded across centuries would require managing not just space, but lifespan, identity and continuity in ways that did not raise suspicion. And that brings the story to the quieter, more delicate question of aging, renewal, and how something long-lived might move through human generations without ever being recognised as the same presence at all. To exist among humans for extended periods without being recognised as fundamentally different would require a careful relationship with time itself, not immortality in the dramatic sense, not endless unchanging life, but something subtler. Longevity without permanence, continuity without stagnation. A way of persisting across generations while allowing the appearance of change, decay, and renewal. For beings like the Anunnaki, longevity would not be a problem to solve, but a condition to manage. Human societies have always been shaped by lifespan. The rhythm of birth, aging, and death defines memory, authority, and identity. Elders are respected because they remember. Leaders are replaced because bodies fail. Knowledge is lost and rediscovered because individuals vanish. Any presence that did not follow this rhythm exactly would eventually attract attention. To blend in fully, long-lived beings would need to mirror the outward patterns of human aging, even if their internal biology differed. Ancient texts already hint at this distinction. The Anunnaki are rarely described as truly immortal in the modern sense. They are long-lived, resilient, and enduring, but not beyond change. They argue, suffer injury, grow weary, and even face death-like states of withdrawal or confinement. This portrayal matters. It suggests beings who experience time differently without existing outside of it entirely. Longevity, not eternity. If such beings lived among humans, managing appearance would be essential. Aging is not just biological, it is social. People expect faces to change, hair to grey, posture to shift. These cues signal belonging. A figure who remains unchanged over decades would be noticed. But one who ages slowly, subtly, and selectively could pass without suspicion, especially in societies where life expectancy was low and records unreliable. Gradual change is difficult to detect without comparison. In the ancient world, people did not carry images of one another across decades. Memory was impressionistic, faces blurred, names repeated. If a being aged slowly enough to remain within the range of human variation, familiarity would shield them from scrutiny. They would be remembered as someone who had always looked more or less the same, a perception humans often apply even to one another. Identity, too, is more flexible than modern assumptions suggest. In early societies, names were titles as much as personal markers. A priest's name could be inherited, a role could be passed down, a lineage could absorb individuality. If a long-lived being shifted identity periodically, stepping into new roles as older ones faded, continuity could be preserved without detection. This does not require deception in the theatrical sense. It requires participation in human social structures. A figure known as a teacher might later be known as an advisor, later still as an elder whose past is spoken of vaguely. Eventually their name becomes a story rather than a person. At that point, stepping back entirely leaves no gap. The memory persists without the presence. Renewal can also occur biologically without immortality. Some species on Earth already demonstrate remarkable regenerative capacity. Cells repair, damage is reversed, aging slows. If the Anunnaki possessed a biology optimized for longevity rather than endless life, they could experience cycles of renewal that reset visible signs of age while maintaining continuity of consciousness. To humans, this would not appear supernatural. it would simply remain unseen. Periods of withdrawal would further mask longevity. A figure who disappears from public life for years or decades and later returns under a different identity avoids direct comparison. In times of war, famine, or migration, such disappearances were common. People vanished regularly. Reappearance did not prompt investigation. Survival itself was remarkable enough. Ancient myths preserve echoes of this pattern. Gods retreat to mountains, the underworld, or distant lands, then return altered, changed names, new roles. These are not necessarily literal journeys. They may represent periods of reduced interaction, renewal, or re-entry under different guises. The story preserves the rhythm even if the mechanics are forgotten. Longevity also affects authority. Humans often defer to those who seem to have seen more. Experience commands respect. A long-lived being would naturally accumulate insight, making them valuable as an advisor rather than a ruler. This aligns with mythological depictions of wise figures who counsel kings rather than rule directly. Influence without exposure is safer than power without restraint. There is also a psychological component. Humans are reluctant to scrutinize those they trust. Trust reduces curiosity. If a figure becomes associated with stability, guidance, or protection, people are less likely to question inconsistencies. An elder who has always been there becomes part of the background of life. Their presence feels reassuring rather than suspicious. The illusion of humanity does not require perfect imitation. Humans accept variation readily when it fits a narrative. Someone who lives long might be seen as blessed. Someone who heals quickly might be favoured. Someone who avoids illness might be lucky. These explanations are culturally available and comforting. They prevent deeper inquiry. Ancient societies did not measure age precisely. Birth records were rare. Time was tracked loosely. Age was estimated based on appearance and status rather than documentation. This ambiguity creates space for longevity to exist unnoticed. Without exact numbers, nothing appears abnormal. The concept of renewal also applies culturally. Human societies renew themselves through ritual, myth, and calendar cycles. Festivals reenact origins. Kings are symbolically reborn. Years reset. A long-lived being participating in these cycles would align themselves with renewal rather than stasis. Change becomes expected rather than alarming. The Anunnaki myths often emphasize cycles. Floods reset civilization. Ages begin and end. Order is restored repeatedly. This cyclical worldview accommodates long-lived figures naturally. They are not out of place in a world that expects repetition rather than linear progress. Withdrawal again plays a role. Longevity draws attention only through sustained visibility. Absence resets perception. A being who steps away during moments of upheaval and returns during stability avoids suspicion. Humans remember those who endure crises, not those who vanish during them. Strategic absence protects identity. There is also the possibility of shared longevity within a small group. A cluster of long-lived beings aging at similar rates would normalize one another. They would appear as a generation rather than as anomalies. Humans compare peers more readily than individuals across time. If several figures age slowly together, none stands out. Bloodlines further complicate perception. If long-lived beings intermingled with humans, descendants might inherit partial traits. Slightly longer lifespans, greater resilience, enhanced cognition. These traits would disperse across populations over generations, creating a gradient rather than a boundary. No single individual would appear non-human. The difference would dissolve into variation. This diffusion aligns with ancient claims of divine ancestry among elites. Kings trace lineage to gods not to claim difference, but legitimacy. Over time, these claims became symbolic, yet they may preserve a memory of gradual integration rather than abrupt separation. The illusion of humanity also benefits from human projection. Humans assume others experience the world as they do. They attribute familiar motivations and limitations to those around them. A being who behaves in expected ways will be assumed to share human constraints, even if they do not. This assumption is rarely tested. Longevity also changes perception of urgency. A long-lived being does not need to act quickly. They can wait. They can observe patterns across generations. This patience itself appears human when framed as wisdom. Slowness becomes thoughtfulness. Distance becomes contemplation. Ancient advisors are often described as cautious, reserved, and deliberate. They speak rarely but with weight. This behavioral pattern aligns perfectly with longevity. Time expands perspective. The future matters more than the moment. Such individuals are respected rather than questioned. The illusion is reinforced by mortality itself. Even long-lived beings would eventually end or transform. Death need not be avoided entirely. It need only be managed. A controlled end preserves the illusion. A being remembered as having died fits expectation. What happens after is irrelevant to perception. Some myths describe gods who die and are reborn under new names. Others speak of apotheosis, transformation rather than extinction. These narratives may encode renewal cycles that preserve continuity while satisfying human expectation of endings. If the Anunnaki practiced such renewal, their presence could persist across millennia without detection. Each cycle would erase suspicion. Each ending would close inquiry. Each return would feel new. This process does not require constant manipulation. It requires understanding human expectations deeply enough to move within them. Humans expect aging. They expect death. They expect renewal through lineage and story. By aligning with these expectations, a long-lived presence becomes invisible. Over time, the original nature of the beings becomes irrelevant. What matters is function. Advisor, guardian, lawgiver, observer. These roles endure even as individuals change. The role becomes the presence. As generations pass, memory compresses. Stories replace faces. Names become titles. Longevity dissolves into myth. The illusion completes itself. From this perspective, the question of immortality loses importance. Eternal life would be a liability. It would attract attention. It would resist closure. Longevity tempered by renewal preserves continuity without exposure. As this idea settles, the Anunnaki appear less as ageless gods and more as patient participants in human time. Beings who understood that to remain unnoticed, one must change just enough to be forgotten, and persist just enough to remain. With aging managed and identity fluid, the foundation is laid for deeper integration. But longevity alone does not ensure invisibility. Influence must also be restrained. Knowledge must be shared without domination. Guidance must occur without rule. That delicate balance leads naturally into the next layer of this quiet coexistence, where power is exercised not through thrones or crowns, but through subtle shaping of civilization from just beyond the center of attention. Power does not always announce itself with banners, crowns, or commands. In many cases, the most enduring influence is exercised quietly, without formal authority, without visible rule, and without ever occupying a throne. For beings seeking to remain among humans without being recognized as fundamentally different, this distinction would be essential. Knowledge can guide without governing. Insight can shape outcomes without claiming credit. And civilizations can be steered gently without ever realizing they are being guided at all. If the Anunnaki possessed advanced understanding of agriculture, engineering, astronomy, or social organization, ruling directly would have been the least effective way to apply it. Thrones attract attention. Kings become targets. Visible power invites rebellion, succession crises, and historical scrutiny. Influence exercised from behind the scenes avoids all of this. It allows systems to evolve while appearing self-generated. Humans are far more comfortable believing they built their own world than acknowledging long-term guidance. Ancient myths already reflect this preference. While gods are described as powerful, they are often curiously absent from day-to-day governance. Kings rule cities, priests manage rituals, administrators collect resources. The divine realm issues decrees, signs, or principles, but rarely handles logistics. This separation suggests an intentional distancing between authority and operation. Influence flows downward, but responsibility remains human. Knowledge is the perfect medium for such influence because it does not require enforcement. Once taught, it propagates itself. A technique learned by one generation becomes tradition in the next. A calendar established once governs centuries. Measurement systems, legal codes, and agricultural practices persist long after their originators are forgotten. Knowledge outlives rulers. It does not need protection. It embeds itself into habit. For advanced beings, this would be the ideal strategy. Teach once, adjust occasionally, then observe. Intervene only when necessary. Allow humans to believe the ideas are their own. Ownership reduces resistance. When people feel they discovered something independently, they defend it fiercely. Guidance disguised as inspiration is far more durable than instruction delivered as command. There is also a practical advantage. Humans are adaptive. They experiment, refine, and localize knowledge. Direct rule freezes development. It locks systems into imposed forms. Indirect guidance allows variation. Humans adapt principles to environment, culture, and circumstance. This produces resilience. A civilization shaped indirectly survives shocks better than one dependent on central authority. The Anunnaki myths often portray them as lawgivers rather than lawmakers. They establish frameworks rather than policies. Concepts like justice, order, balance, and measure recur repeatedly. These are abstract principles, not detailed instructions. They can be interpreted, debated, and applied differently over time. This flexibility is a hallmark of influence designed to endure. Writing itself may be part of this strategy. Early scripts were not designed for storytelling or personal expression. They were accounting tools. They recorded resources, labour, offerings, and obligations. This focus reflects an interest in system stability rather than narrative control. A society that can record and manage complexity no longer needs constant oversight. The system becomes self-regulating. Astronomy offers another example. Teaching humans to track celestial cycles does not require explaining the universe. It requires identifying patterns. Once calendars are established, agricultural cycles stabilize, rituals align, societies coordinate activity. The knowledge does not need to be explained in scientific terms. Its utility is enough. Over time, myth fills the gaps. The origin of the knowledge becomes sacred rather than technical. This separation between function and explanation is crucial. Humans accept results more readily than causes. If something works, its origin matters less. By allowing myth to explain what knowledge enables, advanced beings avoid exposure. The story protects the system by obscuring its source. Influence without thrones also benefits from decentralization. Rather than placing all authority in one figure, knowledge can be distributed across roles. Priests guard ritual knowledge, scribes guard writing, builders guard technique. No single group sees the full picture. Fragmentation prevents holistic understanding. It also prevents rebellion against a hidden source because no one knows it exists. This pattern appears consistently in early civilizations. Knowledge is compartmentalized. Initiation rituals control access. Sacred texts are restricted. Transmission is slow and deliberate. These practices are often explained as preserving purity or tradition, but they also serve to limit awareness. The fewer people who understand something fully, the less likely it is to be questioned. Advisors occupy a particularly effective position in this system. They speak, but they do not decide. They guide, but they do not rule. When outcomes are successful, credit goes to leaders. When outcomes fail, blame does as well. Advisors remain insulated. Their influence continues regardless of political shifts. Dynasties rise and fall, but counsel persists. Ancient literature frequently describes wise figures who outlast kings. They appear across reigns, offering continuity. Their loyalty is to order rather than to individuals. This role aligns perfectly with long-lived beings seeking stability rather than recognition. Remaining outside formal power structures reduces risk and visibility. There is also the advantage of plausible ignorance. Humans rarely suspect guidance when they believe they are acting independently. Innovations are attributed to genius, luck, or divine inspiration. The idea that knowledge could be seeded intentionally is uncomfortable, because it undermines agency. Most societies prefer to believe in spontaneous progress. Over time, this preference becomes a shield. Even when evidence of advanced knowledge appears earlier than expected, explanations are found. Coincidence, lost civilizations, exceptional individuals. The possibility of sustained external guidance is rarely considered seriously. It remains speculative, marginal, and easily dismissed. Influencing from the shadows also allows selective intervention. Not all problems require correction. Some collapses are necessary, some failures teach lessons. An advanced presence concerned with long-term development would not prevent every disaster. It would allow cycles of growth and decline to occur, intervening only when trajectories threaten extinction rather than discomfort. This restraint is visible in myth. Gods intervene dramatically only at extremes: floods, plagues, cosmic resets. These are not micromanagement tools, they are last resorts. Most of the time, humans are left to struggle, adapt, and rebuild. The guidance remains implicit rather than explicit. The absence of thrones also protects against worship becoming too literal. When beings rule openly, reverence turns into dependency. Humans stop acting independently. Development stagnates. By remaining distant, influence encourages autonomy. Humans grow into their systems rather than relying on overseers. This autonomy eventually allows advanced beings to withdraw further without destabilizing society. Once humans believe they are fully in control, the hidden influence can recede even more. The system runs on inertia. Tradition becomes self-sustaining. Language reflects this transition. Early texts speak of gods deciding. Later texts speak of fate, law, or order. Agency shifts from beings to abstractions. The abstraction absorbs authority. Once authority is abstract, it no longer needs a visible source. From a strategic perspective, this is the most secure outcome. Abstractions cannot be overthrown. They cannot be confronted. They are everywhere and nowhere. A being who embeds influence into abstraction becomes untouchable. Over centuries, the original influences fade completely from conscious awareness. Their names survive in myth. Their functions survive in institutions. Their intentions survive in values, but their presence is no longer imagined as literal. It becomes symbolic. This symbolic survival is safer than physical survival. Symbols are not hunted. They are studied, debated, reinterpreted. They attract curiosity rather than fear. A hidden presence benefits when attention shifts from reality to meaning. If the Anunnaki chose this path, their success would be measured not by monuments or memories, but by invisibility itself. The fact that civilizations continue to reflect principles first introduced in deep antiquity without remembering their source suggests a guidance so complete that it erased itself. This erasure is not failure, it is culmination. Influence that persists without attribution has achieved permanence. As this layer settles, the Anunnaki no longer resemble rulers displaced by time. They resemble architects who stepped away once the structure could stand on its own. Their absence from thrones is not evidence of retreat, but proof of restraint. Yet influence without rule introduces another challenge. Knowledge must be transmitted accurately without revealing its origin. Communication must occur across cultures, languages, and generations. For that, another form of blending becomes essential. The ability to speak, teach, and translate ideas in ways that feel entirely human. And that quiet challenge leads into the next part of this story, where language itself becomes both a bridge and a veil. Language is often imagined as the greatest barrier between fundamentally different beings. Different origins imply different sounds, structures, symbols, and ways of thinking. From a modern perspective, communication between species is assumed to be difficult, technical, and prone to failure. Yet this assumption comes from projecting modern complexity backward. In the ancient world, language was fluid, adaptive, and deeply shaped by imitation. It was not standardized, it was not fixed, and it did not belong exclusively to any single group for very long. For advanced beings living among early humans, language would not have been an obstacle. It would have been an entry point. Early human languages were not rigid systems with strict grammar and dictionaries. They were living tools shaped by daily use. Words shifted meaning quickly. Sounds varied between neighbouring groups. Gesture, context, and shared experience carried as much weight as syntax. In such an environment, mastery of language did not require perfection. It required attunement. If the Anunnaki existed among humans, their first linguistic advantage would be time. Time allows listening. Time allows pattern recognition. Time allows gradual adaptation without forcing innovation. A long-lived presence could absorb speech rhythms, tonal patterns, and symbolic associations across generations. What feels difficult to learn in a short human lifespan becomes trivial when time is abundant. There is also the reality that language learning is asymmetrical. Humans expect outsiders to speak imperfectly. Accents are normal. Variations are tolerated. A being who spoke slightly differently would not raise alarm. They would simply be categorized as foreign, regional, or learned. Difference in speech rarely triggers suspicion of non-human origin. It triggers assumptions of geography or class. Early societies were accustomed to linguistic diversity. Trade, migration, and intermarriage brought constant exposure to new dialects. Multilingualism was common among elites and intermediaries. Translators existed long before writing. A figure who spoke multiple languages would not appear strange. They would appear useful. Language also encodes worldview. But worldviews were not unified. Early humans did not assume everyone thought the same way. Differences in belief, custom, and interpretation were normal. A being whose conceptual framework differed slightly would not stand out unless they insisted on imposing it. Quiet alignment mattered more than philosophical agreement. Advanced beings would not need to explain their origin linguistically. They would need to explain function, how to plant, when to harvest, how to measure, how to resolve disputes. Practical language grounds communication in shared goals. It bypasses metaphysical curiosity. When language solves problems, questions fade. Many ancient myths emphasize that gods taught humans directly, speaking to them as one would speak to a child or apprentice. This framing suggests communication that was not alien or incomprehensible, but accessible. The gods are not described as struggling to be understood. They're understood too well. The danger is not miscommunication, but disobedience. This implies a shared linguistic space rather than a bridged one. The Anunnaki in such accounts speak the language of humans, not the other way around. That does not require identical origins. It requires linguistic flexibility. Language also hides origin through metaphor. Humans naturally encode complex ideas in story, symbol, and analogy. Teaching through metaphor allows information to be transmitted without revealing technical detail. A story can preserve structure while disguising mechanism. This is one of the most effective forms of long-term communication ever developed. If advanced beings needed to share knowledge without exposing themselves, metaphor would be ideal. Instructions embedded in myth are resistant to scrutiny. They are preserved through ritual rather than analysis. Humans repeat them without fully unpacking them. Over time, meaning shifts while function remains. Consider astronomical knowledge. Rather than explaining orbital mechanics, ancient teachers described gods moving through the sky, battling, marrying, and returning. These stories encode cycles, they preserve timing, they guide observation, but they do not invite investigation into origin. The sky becomes narrative rather than system. The same applies to law. Rather than presenting abstract legal theory, early societies framed law as divine command. This grants authority without explanation. People obey not because they understand the system, but because the system feels inevitable. Language here serves to close inquiry rather than open it. Advanced beings would understand this instinctively. Explaining too much invites questions. Questions invite attention. Attention invites exposure. Language that satisfies emotional and social needs prevents curiosity from turning analytical. Writing further enhances this effect. Early writing systems were logographic and symbolic. They did not transcribe speech perfectly. They represented ideas, quantities, and actions. This abstraction creates distance between language and speaker. Once written, words lose their voice. Origin disappears. Texts attributed to gods do not require the gods to be present. The text speaks for them. Over time, interpretation replaces interaction. Priests replace teachers. Commentary replaces conversation. Language becomes institutional rather than personal. If the Anunnaki initiated writing or influenced its development, they would have created a communication system that outlasted their presence. Writing freezes language at a moment in time. It preserves authority while allowing absence. This is an ideal outcome for a hidden presence. Language also creates hierarchy. Sacred languages emerge. Special vocabularies reserved for ritual, law, or scholarship. These linguistic barriers restrict access. Only initiates understand fully. Others accept partially. Fragmentation protects the whole. An advanced presence embedded in such systems could communicate selectively, speak plainly to some, symbolically to others, remain silent to most. Silence itself communicates authority when framed correctly. Unspoken knowledge becomes sacred. Humans are remarkably willing to accept that some truths are not meant for them. Language reinforces this belief. When words are withheld or encoded, curiosity turns inward rather than outward. People assume limitation is their own, not imposed. Pronunciation and accent offer further camouflage. No one expects perfect uniformity. Variation is normal. A being whose speech is unusually precise might be seen as educated. One whose speech is archaic might be seen as traditional. One whose speech is sparse might be seen as wise. All interpretations protect the speaker. Over generations, language shifts naturally. Words change meaning. Sounds erode. Grammar simplifies or complicates. A long-lived being would notice these changes and adapt. But adaptation does not require constant reinvention. Speaking slightly out of date is often interpreted as authority rather than error. Elders preserve old forms. Tradition protects difference. Myths often portray gods speaking in archaic or elevated language. This is not evidence of otherworldliness. It is a linguistic marker of status. Humans associate formality with authority. A being who speaks carefully, deliberately, and sparingly gains respect without revealing origin. There is also the phenomenon of internal translation. Humans often reinterpret what they hear to fit expectation. If something is unclear, listeners fill gaps unconsciously. This cognitive habit smooths communication. A speaker does not need to be perfectly aligned with listener understanding. The listener will do part of the work. This effect is magnified in oral cultures. Stories are retold, not repeated verbatim. Each retelling adapts language to audience and context. Original phrasing dissolves quickly. Meaning persists. Origin vanishes. Language barriers dissolve naturally under these conditions. There is no sharp boundary to cross. Communication is negotiated continuously. A being attentive to feedback would adjust instinctively. Even complex concepts can be transmitted gradually. Teach observation before explanation. Teach practice before theory. Humans learn through doing. Language that accompanies action feels natural. The origin of the instruction becomes irrelevant. This may explain why ancient technologies appear suddenly, but without clear explanatory texts. The knowledge existed in practice, not in description. Language served to coordinate, not to document. Once practice was established, explanation was unnecessary. The absence of technical language is itself a form of concealment. Without vocabulary, concepts cannot be analysed. Without analysis, origin cannot be traced. Knowledge remains embodied rather than abstract. The Anunnaki myths reflect this. They speak commands, not equations. They give names, not mechanisms. Naming grants control without disclosure. When something is named, it can be used without being understood. Language also binds communities emotionally. Shared words create shared identity. A being who adopts local language adopts local belonging. They become one of us linguistically, even if they are not biologically. Once belonging is established, origin loses relevance. Humans rarely question where someone came from once they are embedded socially. The story of arrival fades quickly. What matters is participation. Over time, even memory of linguistic difference disappears. Later generations assume shared language has always existed. The possibility that it was learned rather than inherited is forgotten. From this perspective, language is not a barrier at all. It is the most effective camouflage available. It allows presence without exposure, guidance without explanation, authority without force. If advanced beings mastered human language early, they would not struggle to communicate. They would struggle to avoid saying too much. Restraint would be the greater challenge. And restraint is visible everywhere in ancient texts. The gods speak rarely. When they do, their words are brief, decisive, and often ambiguous. Ambiguity protects speaker and system alike. As language becomes symbolic, ritualized, and institutionalized, the need for direct communication vanishes. The system speaks for itself. Law speaks. Myth speaks. Tradition speaks. At that point, the original speakers are no longer required. Their voices echo without sound. This quiet mastery of language would allow the Anunnaki to remain among humans indefinitely without ever revealing origin. Words would flow naturally. Meaning would land where intended. Questions would be answered just enough to close them. And once language itself becomes a veil, the final layer of concealment emerges. Because communication is not only about speech, it is also about connection, about kinship, about who belongs to whom. When beings begin to share bloodlines, families and generations, language becomes secondary. Identity becomes biological. And that leads directly into the next part of this story, where integration moves beyond words and into lineage itself, dissolving difference not through speech, but through inheritance. Integration does not require conquest, announcement, or even agreement. Over long spans of time, the most complete form of integration happens quietly, through families, kinship, and inheritance. Bloodlines do not attract attention the way monuments do. They do not announce themselves the way laws do. They simply continue. If the Anunnaki sought permanence without visibility, then integration through lineage, adoption, and gradual blending would be the most effective strategy available to them. Ancient societies understood identity very differently from the modern world. Personhood was not defined primarily by individuality, but by belonging. Family, clan, household, and ancestry determined who someone was, what rights they held, and what obligations followed them. To be part of a lineage was to be real. To exist outside lineage was to be unstable, suspicious, or temporary. For advanced beings wishing to exist unnoticed, embedding themselves within kinship structures would be more effective than any disguise. Myths across cultures preserve repeated references to unions between gods and humans. These are often dismissed as symbolic, poetic, or allegorical, but their consistency is striking. The offspring of these unions are not described as monsters or aberrations. They are heroes, kings, founders, and lawgivers. They occupy leadership roles naturally, as if their mixed origin grants legitimacy rather than fear. This framing suggests not horror at difference, but acceptance of continuity. Bloodline integration solves multiple problems at once. It explains exceptional individuals without requiring ongoing divine presence. It distributes traits gradually across populations. It transforms difference into heritage rather than anomaly. Over generations, what began as distinct becomes diffuse. The boundary dissolves not by force, but by dilution. If the Anunnaki possessed biological compatibility with humans, even partial, then interbreeding would be inevitable over long periods of proximity. Complete separation would require constant enforcement. Integration requires only time. Even if such unions were rare, their genetic and social impact would compound. Descendants would inherit fragments rather than wholes. No single individual would appear non-human. Difference would scatter into variation. Ancient elite lineages often claim divine descent. This is typically interpreted as political propaganda, but propaganda itself usually rests on some prior belief. A claim resonates only if it fits cultural memory. If early leaders truly descended from beings perceived as divine, the claim would not feel fabricated. It would feel explanatory. Over time, as biological difference diminished, the claim would shift from literal to symbolic, without ever being fully discarded. Adoption offers another pathway of integration. Many ancient societies practiced formal adoption, often as a political or religious act. A child taken into a household became fully part of that lineage regardless of birth. Identity followed nurture as much as nature. For beings seeking to embed influence without leaving clear biological traces, adoption would be an ideal mechanism. Knowledge, status, and continuity could be preserved without genetic exposure. Myths frequently describe gods raising human children, fostering heroes, or selecting individuals for special upbringing. These stories encode a pattern of mentorship and inheritance that does not require biological connection. Cultural traits, values, and roles can be transmitted just as effectively through upbringing as through blood. Over generations, the distinction between inherited and taught disappears. Quiet integration also benefits from the way memory operates. Humans remember lineages selectively. Prominent ancestors are remembered. Ordinary ones are forgotten. Over time, genealogies compress. Branches vanish. Origins blur. Even if an unusual ancestor existed, their specificity would dissolve within a few generations. What remains is status, not explanation. This compression is visible in ancient king lists and genealogies that stretch improbably far into the past. Names repeat, timelines overlap. The purpose is not accuracy, it is continuity. The message is that the line endures, not that the details matter. A long-lived or non-human origin can be absorbed into such structures easily. Bloodline integration also offers a solution to longevity. A being does not need to persist personally if their influence persists biologically. Descendants carry forward traits, tendencies, and capacities without requiring the original presence. Over time, even the memory of origin becomes unnecessary. The system runs on inheritance. There is also the advantage of invisibility through normalcy. Families draw less scrutiny than individuals. A household blends into a city more easily than a solitary figure. Generations provide cover. Change appears natural. Aging appears expected. No single moment invites questioning. Ancient societies were also far less concerned with genetic purity than later cultures. Intermarriage between groups was common and often strategic. Difference was managed socially, not biologically. A child who belonged to a household belonged fully. Questions of origin were secondary to loyalty and function. This openness creates fertile ground for quiet integration. A being or group could enter a society, form alliances, intermarry, and become indistinguishable within a few generations. Their origin would be remembered, if at all, as legend rather than fact. The extraordinary would become ancestral rather than present. Some myths preserve this transition explicitly. The gods withdraw, but their descendants remain. The age of gods ends, but the age of heroes begins. Heroes are often described as less powerful, more human, but still exceptional. This gradual reduction aligns with dilution rather than disappearance. Power fades into capability. Divinity fades into talent. The idea of chosen bloodlines also persists stubbornly across history. Certain families repeatedly rise to prominence across eras and regions. This is often explained through wealth, education, or social advantage, but these explanations do not exclude deeper continuity. Once a lineage gains early advantage, it perpetuates itself through marriage, adoption, and opportunity. Influence compounds quietly. If the Anunnaki integrated through bloodlines, they would not need to maintain control directly. Their descendants would occupy roles of influence naturally. Over time, even they would forget their origin. Identity becomes human by default. Only subtle traits remain, scattered across populations. Such traits might include increased longevity, resistance to disease, heightened perception, or unusual cognitive ability. But these traits would not cluster cleanly. They would appear sporadically. Humans already accept such variation. Genius, resilience, and intuition are celebrated without requiring non-human explanation. Quiet integration also protects against extinction. A separate population can be destroyed. A hidden one embedded within another cannot. Integration distributes risk. Even catastrophic events would not erase presence entirely. Something would always survive within the larger population. Flood myths, collapses, and resets appear repeatedly in ancient stories. The gods survive. Humans are reduced. Civilization restarts. If the Anunnaki were integrated biologically and socially, such resets would not remove them. They would persist invisibly through descendants, mentors, and institutional memory. Adoption also allows continuity of knowledge. A being does not need to teach everyone. Teaching one child deeply may be enough. That child teaches others. Knowledge spreads without attribution. Over generations, the source disappears completely. This pattern mirrors how many ancient crafts and sciences developed. Skills were passed through apprenticeship. Masters selected students. Knowledge was guarded, not broadcast. Origins were not recorded. Authority rested on lineage of teaching rather than proof. This system is perfectly suited to quiet influence. The idea of bloodlines also reframes the notion of disappearance. The gods did not vanish. They diffused. They became part of humanity rather than separate from it. From that point on, noticing them would be impossible because there would be nothing distinct to notice. Later religious traditions often struggle with this ambiguity. They insist on separation. Gods must be other. Humans must be distinct. But earlier myths are less concerned with purity. They accept overlap. They accept ambiguity. They accept that the boundary between divine and human is porous. This older worldview may preserve a more accurate memory, one in which beings who were once clearly distinct gradually became familiar, then ancestral, then symbolic. The transition feels natural rather than traumatic. No invasion, no exodus, just time. As generations pass, the language of bloodline becomes metaphor. Divine descent becomes a claim of legitimacy rather than literal ancestry. Yet the persistence of the claim suggests something more than invention. It suggests a memory that outlived its explanation. Quiet integration through bloodlines would also explain why no single moment marks the end of divine presence. There is no final departure because there is no separation. The presence changes form rather than location. From this perspective, the Anunnaki living among humans is not a story of concealment, but of transformation. They do not hide behind masks. They dissolve into families. They do not rule forever. They see continuity and step back. As this idea settles, the image of hidden visitors shifts again. They are no longer watchers at the edge of society. They are participants whose legacy is carried forward invisibly, embedded in lineage rather than memory. And yet bloodlines alone do not preserve awareness. Over time, even ancestry becomes symbolic. To protect deeper truths, another layer is needed. A way to store memory without revealing it. A method of hiding information where it will be preserved rather than questioned. That method appears again and again across cultures, quietly doing its work. Myth itself. Stories that look like fiction, feel like belief, and function like vaults. And it is there, in that space between story and truth, that the next part of this exploration naturally leads. Stories are rarely treated as evidence. They are placed gently to the side of serious inquiry, labelled as metaphor, belief, entertainment, or imagination. This dismissal is precisely what makes them such effective vessels for preservation. Myths endure not because they are accurate in a literal sense, but because they are meaningful. They are repeated, protected, and passed on without demanding verification. If something needed to survive across millennia without drawing analytical scrutiny, myth would be the ideal place to hide it. For being seeking to coexist with humans without being identified as non-human, myth offers a form of camouflage far more reliable than secrecy. Secrecy invites investigation. Silence creates gaps. Myths, by contrast, overflow with explanation. They feel complete. They satisfy curiosity emotionally while deflecting it intellectually. A listener feels they understand, even when they do not. This sense of understanding closes the door to further questioning. Ancient myths are not random collections of fantasy. They are structured, repetitive, and surprisingly consistent across cultures separated by geography and time. Floods, sky beings, divine teachers, golden ages, withdrawn gods, chosen bloodlines. These motifs recur with such regularity that they suggest inheritance rather than invention. Yet because they are wrapped in symbolic language, they remain safely distant from literal interpretation. This distance is critical. A story that is too realistic invites verification. A story that is too abstract invites reinterpretation. Myth occupies a narrow space between the two. It feels grounded enough to be remembered, but fantastical enough to be dismissed. This balance allows information to persist without ever being interrogated directly. If the Anunnaki influenced early human civilization and later chose to reduce visibility, embedding memory within myth would be an elegant solution. Myths allow truths to be told indirectly. They encode relationships, hierarchies, and sequences of events without specifying mechanisms. They preserve structure while obscuring process. Over time, listeners focus on meaning rather than origin. Consider how myths describe gods. They are anthropomorphic, emotional, flawed, and social. They argue, negotiate, punish, and reconcile. These behaviors mirror those of ruling elites more than abstract cosmic forces. Yet because the characters are labelled divine, their actions are removed from historical scrutiny. No one asks whether a god truly held a council. It is accepted as symbolic. The possibility that such councils reflected real, administrative gatherings is never examined. Myths also flatten time. Thousands of years collapse into a single narrative arc. Characters persist across epochs. Events are reordered to serve coherence rather than chronology. This compression erases distinctions that might otherwise reveal continuity. A long-lived presence becomes timeless rather than extended. Longevity transforms into eternity. Change transforms into archetype. This transformation is protective. A being remembered as eternal cannot be measured. A figure placed outside time cannot be questioned using historical tools. Myth lifts events out of linear analysis and places them into cyclical or symbolic frameworks. The past becomes a pattern rather than a record. Another powerful feature of myth is role reassignment. Real functions become symbolic identities. Teachers become gods of wisdom. Administrators become gods of law. Engineers become gods of creation. Observers become gods of fate. The role remains, but the human context is stripped away. Once that happens, the origin of the role no longer matters. This reassignment also fragments truth. No single myth contains the whole story. Information is distributed across traditions, regions, and eras. Each culture preserves a piece shaped by its own needs. Comparison reveals patterns, but comparison itself is a modern habit. Ancient societies did not compile global mythologies. Each story stood alone, internally coherent and unchallenged. Fragmentation protects against exposure. Even if one myth appears suspiciously detailed, it is isolated. Without corroboration, it is dismissed as unique. Only when myths are viewed collectively does their consistency become apparent. By then they are already labelled fiction. Myths also benefit from ritualization. Stories tied to ritual become sacred. Sacred narratives are not dissected, they are performed. Repetition replaces analysis. Meaning is felt rather than examined. Once a story is embedded in ritual, questioning it feels inappropriate or dangerous. This emotional barrier is more effective than any guard. Humans self-censor when something feels sacred. They protect it from scrutiny out of reverence rather than fear. A truth hidden within sacred narrative is safer than one locked behind walls. Myths also shift responsibility. When events are attributed to gods, human agency fades. This removes the need to explain mechanisms. A flood occurs because a god is angry. A city falls because fate decrees it. These explanations satisfy emotional need without inviting technical inquiry. They close the causal loop prematurely. For a hidden presence, this is ideal. Real interventions, adjustments, or withdrawals can be remembered as divine acts without exposing the decision-making process behind them. Outcomes are remembered. Methods are forgotten. Over time, myth becomes entertainment as well as belief. Stories are told to children. They're dramatized. They're moralized. Each retelling moves them further from literal interpretation. Yet the core structure persists. This persistence is not accidental. It reflects something resilient beneath the embellishment. The Anunnaki myths contain repeated emphasis on teaching, law-giving, and structuring the world. They are not myths of random chaos. They are myths of order imposed. This focus suggests memory of organization rather than imagination of power. Chaos myths feel different. They are less concerned with instruction. Myths also preserve withdrawal narratives carefully. The gods leave because humans are noisy. Because the world has changed. Because an age has ended. These explanations normalize absence. They prevent longing for return. They frame separation as necessary and final. Yet the gods never truly vanish. They remain watching. They remain judging. They remain involved indirectly. This tension allows belief in presence without expectation of appearance, a perfect state for continued invisibility. Myths further protect truth by exaggeration. Real abilities become miracles. Real technologies become magic. Once exaggerated, they become unbelievable. No one looks for literal fire weapons or flying machines in myth, because they are assumed symbolic. This assumption prevents archaeological curiosity. Even when artifacts resemble mythic descriptions, they are explained away as coincidence or misinterpretation. The myth inoculates reality against discovery by rendering it implausible. Names within myths also act as veils. Specific individuals become composite figures. Multiple beings merge into one god splits into many. Identity dissolves. Tracking continuity becomes impossible. A presence that operated across time becomes mythically timeless rather than historically traceable. Language within myth further distorts perception. Terms like heaven, earth, and underworld shift meaning across cultures. Physical locations become metaphysical realms. Movement becomes metaphor. Real transitions become symbolic journeys. Each layer of interpretation adds distance from literal understanding. Myths are also resistant to correction. Once established, they persist even when contradicted by observation. This resistance ensures longevity. A narrative that cannot be falsified cannot be erased. It simply adapts. This adaptability allows myths to survive cultural shifts. When belief systems change, old myths are reinterpreted rather than discarded. Gods become allegories. Allegories become literature. Literature becomes folklore. At no point is the story fully abandoned. It simply changes costume. For a hidden presence, this ensures that memory never fully disappears. It remains accessible, but only to those willing to look beyond surface interpretation. Even then, certainty remains elusive. Doubt protects truth by preventing consensus. Myths also exploit human pattern recognition. We seek meaning instinctively. We connect symbols. We sense significance even when we cannot articulate it. Myths feed this instinct without satisfying it completely. The unresolved tension keeps stories alive. This tension may explain why certain myths feel unsettling rather than comforting. They hint at something incomplete, something withheld. This unease is not accidental. It reflects the compression of lived reality into symbolic form. The persistence of Anunnaki-like figures across unrelated cultures suggests that myth served as a shared storage system, rather than isolated invention. Stories travelled with people. They adapted to new environments while retaining core structures. This portability makes myth a superior archive to stone or text. Stone erodes, text is lost. Stories live as long as people do. By hiding truth in story, a presence ensures survival, even through collapse. Libraries burn, cities fall, empires vanish, stories migrate, refugees carry them, children learn them. The memory endures without ever being labelled as history. This method does not require active maintenance. Once embedded, myth sustains itself. Humans do the work of preservation unknowingly. Curiosity is redirected toward meaning rather than origin. In this sense, myth is not deception, it is translation. It translates lived experience into symbolic language that humans can carry across time. Precision is sacrificed for survival. If the Anunnaki understood this, then myth would be their final and most effective veil. Not to erase themselves, but to remain present without exposure. To be remembered without being recognized. The truth, compressed into story, would sit in plain sight, read aloud, sung, painted, sculpted, yet never examined as literal memory because it feels too strange, too old, too symbolic. And this is the brilliance of myth as misdirection. It does not hide by removing information. It hides by surrounding it with meaning. As long as something feels explained, humans stop looking deeper. From here, the narrative does not move toward revelation, but toward daily life. Because once truth is hidden in story and presence is diffused into culture, coexistence no longer requires distance or withdrawal alone. It requires routine, ordinary days, shared spaces. The next layer of this exploration settles not in temples or epics, but in streets, homes and habits, in what it would mean to wake, work and rest beside beings whose origin was long forgotten, whose presence was normalized, and whose difference had dissolved into the background of everyday human life. When presence becomes routine, it ceases to feel like presence at all. It becomes background. It becomes assumed. This is the quiet moment where watchers stop being perceived as separate and begin to exist simply as neighbours. not because they announce a change, but because familiarity erodes distinction. If the Anunnaki lived among humans for long enough, this transition would not feel dramatic. It would feel mundane, and mundanity is the strongest cloak imaginable. Daily life in early human settlements was repetitive by necessity. Dawn, labour, meals, rest. Tasks were governed by seasons and survival rather than novelty. In such a rhythm, anything that did not disrupt the pattern would blend seamlessly into it. A neighbour who worked, spoke, and rested according to the same cycles would not invite curiosity. Difference is noticed only when it interrupts expectation. Consistency dissolves attention. The idea of watchers implies distance, observation without participation. But true invisibility requires participation. To be present without being noticed, one must share routines, draw water from the same wells, walk the same paths, attend the same gatherings. Absence of spectacle is more convincing than concealment. A being who lives quietly within a community becomes part of its mental landscape. Ancient settlements were intimate spaces. People lived close together. Privacy was limited. This closeness paradoxically creates invisibility. When everyone is always present, no one is truly watched. Familiarity becomes noise. A figure seen every day is not examined every day. The mind filters what it expects to see. If the Anunnaki shared living spaces with humans, they would not need to hide extraordinary behaviour. They would need to avoid it. Eating the same food, showing fatigue, expressing concern, participating in work. These behaviours signal belonging. Humans judge humanity through shared vulnerability more than through appearance. Even advanced knowledge would not be obvious in daily life. Knowing more does not require showing more. Wisdom expressed sparingly reads as maturity rather than difference. A neighbour who offers advice occasionally is valued. One who constantly demonstrates superiority is resented. Restraint is key. Daily interactions also fragment perception. No one sees the whole of another person's life. Neighbours observe fragments. A conversation here, a gesture there. Partial views prevent holistic judgment. An anomaly seen once is forgotten. A pattern seen rarely is dismissed. Early communities were also structured around cooperation. Survival depended on mutual reliance. This creates trust by default. Trust reduces suspicion. Once someone contributes, they are accepted. Questioning their nature feels unnecessary and even dangerous to group cohesion. There is also the psychological effect of shared hardship. Those who endure the same struggles are perceived as the same. Hunger, illness, loss. These experiences bind groups together. A being who participates in hardship, even superficially, earns inclusion. Humans do not scrutinize those who suffer alongside them. If the Anunnaki possessed resilience beyond human norms, they could still mirror vulnerability selectively. No one expects equal suffering. Variation exists naturally. Some people fall ill often, others rarely. Some heal quickly, others do not. This variability protects difference. Daily life also includes emotional expression, grief, frustration, humour. Emotional fluency signals belonging more strongly than biology. A being who reacts appropriately to events is assumed to share the same internal world. Humans project similarity readily. Children play a role here as well. Children accept others easily. They normalize presence quickly. A figure known to children becomes safe by default. Over generations, children grow up never questioning who has always been there. Memory resets with each generation. Work routines further obscure difference. Tasks define identity more than origin. A potter is a potter. A farmer is a farmer. Skill matters, not source. Mastery earns respect. In early societies, skilled individuals were prized regardless of background. Markets, gatherings, and festivals amplify this effect. Crowds blur individuality. Participation matters more than identity. A being who attends, trades, celebrates and mourns becomes woven into social fabric. Ritual equalizes. Everyone performs the same actions regardless of belief. Ritual also creates shared meaning. Performing the same act reinforces unity. A being participating in ritual does not appear separate. They appear devoted. Even if their understanding differs, outward conformity is enough. Homes themselves contribute to invisibility. Domestic spaces are repetitive. Similar layouts, similar tools. Living within such spaces creates visual uniformity. Nothing stands out. Even advanced beings would use the same objects for the same reasons. Function over novelty. Night further dissolves distinction. In darkness, difference fades. Fires flicker, faces blur. Conversation becomes sound rather than sight. Nighttime is when stories are told, not identities examined. A presence during these hours feels communal rather than individual. Sleep is also revealing. Sharing rest patterns signals biology. A being who sleeps when others sleep is assumed to share human limits. Even if sleep functions differently, mimicking the pattern would suffice. Humans do not monitor one another's consciousness. Illness and healing offer another layer. Communities relied on healers who were expected to know more than others. A being who healed effectively would not be questioned. They would be valued. Healing does not require explanation. Results matter more than method. Over time, such figures become fixtures. The healer, the elder, the quiet neighbour. Their presence becomes part of place identity. Removing them would feel disruptive. Their continued presence feels normal. This normalization explains why myths often describe gods walking among humans unnoticed, until something reveals them. Recognition is rare because familiarity blinds perception. Only disruption restores attention. Daily life also limits memory. Humans remember events, not constants. What changes is remembered. What stays the same fades. A long-lived presence that maintains consistency becomes invisible precisely because it does not change. If the Anunnaki lived this way, their existence would not feel secretive. It would feel ordinary. Ordinary enough that later generations would struggle to imagine that anything unusual ever occurred. Memory would reframe presence as ancestry or myth. Over centuries, daily coexistence would dissolve difference entirely. The watchers would no longer be watchers. They would simply be people. Their origin would matter less than their role. This is perhaps the most unsettling possibility, that extraordinary beings did not hide behind walls or technologies, but behind routine, that they did not observe from afar but from across the street. Once this state is reached, separation becomes conceptual rather than physical. Humans begin to believe the gods are elsewhere because they stop looking nearby. The familiar cannot be divine because it is familiar, and so the watchers become neighbours, the neighbours become background, the background becomes invisible. At that point, the only thing that could reveal such coexistence would be disruption, fear, curiosity, or a reason to look again. Which raises the next quiet question. If such beings lived among humans successfully for so long, what would make them choose silence over speech, distance over closeness, and invisibility over explanation? The answer does not lie in fear of discovery, but in fear of consequence. And that leads naturally into the consideration of why remaining unseen may not have been a preference, but a necessity shaped by the risks of revelation itself. Silence is often mistaken for absence, weakness, or retreat. In reality, silence is one of the most deliberate and powerful choices an intelligent presence can make. It is not the lack of communication, but the refusal to disrupt a fragile balance. If the Anunnaki lived among humans unnoticed for generations, their silence would not have been accidental. It would have been a calculated response to a danger far greater than discovery itself. The danger of destabilizing the very civilizations they had helped shape. Revelation is not neutral. It does not simply add information to a culture. It reshapes identity, authority, belief, and social order all at once. For early human societies whose cohesion depended on shared myths, hierarchies, and explanations of the world, sudden revelation of a non-human presence living among them would not have produced enlightenment. It would have produced fracture. Human cultures are built on stories that explain who belongs, who leads, and why the world is structured the way it is. These stories are not optional. They are psychological scaffolding. Remove them abruptly and the structure collapses. The Anunnaki, if they understood human psychology as deeply as their myths suggest, would have recognized that revealing themselves would not elevate humanity. It would destabilize it. Authority is the first fault line. In societies where kings ruled by divine mandate and priests mediated between the human and the sacred, the revelation that the gods were not distant, abstract forces but present beings living quietly among the population would undermine every existing hierarchy. Who truly speaks for the gods if the gods are present? Who has legitimacy if divine authority can be questioned directly? Entire systems of governance would unravel overnight. This is not speculation. Human history provides countless examples of what happens when foundational beliefs are challenged too quickly. Political revolutions triggered by ideological shock often lead to violence, purges, and prolonged instability. Religious schisms fracture communities for centuries. Even minor doctrinal disputes have ignited wars. A revelation of living, integrated, non-human overseers would dwarf all of these disruptions combined. Belief itself would fracture along predictable lines. Some humans would worship the revealed beings obsessively. Others would reject them violently. Some would attempt to control or exploit them. Others would deny their existence altogether. Unity would evaporate. Fear and fanaticism would take its place. The Anunnaki would not need to imagine this outcome. They would see it immediately. Humans respond to the unknown with extremes. Reverence turns into dependency. Dependency turns into resentment. Resentment turns into rebellion. Silence avoids this spiral entirely. There is also the problem of expectation. Once revealed, the Anunnaki would be expected to intervene constantly. Every disaster would become their responsibility. Every injustice would demand correction. Every failure would be blamed on inaction. Silence preserves autonomy. Revelation invites endless obligation. A presence that reveals itself becomes trapped by its own visibility. It must explain, justify, and defend every decision. A presence that remains silent can influence selectively. Silence allows choice. Speech creates accountability. Cultural collapse is not only political or religious, it is psychological. Humans derive meaning from feeling central to their own story. The idea that humanity is the primary actor in its development is deeply embedded in identity. Revelation would reframe humans as secondary participants in a guided experiment, rather than authors of their own civilization. This realization would not inspire gratitude, it would produce humiliation. Pride wounded at civilizational scale rarely results in calm reflection. It results in denial, anger, and the rewriting of history to reclaim agency. Even the suggestion that human achievements were influenced or guided undermines motivation. Why strive if progress is orchestrated? Why innovate if outcomes are predetermined? Silence preserves the illusion of authorship, which is essential for growth. The Anunnaki myths themselves reflect awareness of this risk. Stories describe gods withdrawing because humans became unruly, noisy, or disrespectful. These are not moral judgments alone. They reflect a breakdown in productive relationship. Too much proximity erodes reverence. Too much knowledge erodes stability. There is also the problem of scale. Early human societies were small. Revelation might be managed locally. But as populations grew into cities and empires, information spread faster. Controlling narrative would become impossible. Competing interpretations would multiply. Conflict would become inevitable. Once revealed, the Anunnaki would no longer be able to choose how they were perceived. Others would define them, label them, fear them, weaponize them symbolically or literally. Silence avoids this loss of control. Technology adds another layer of danger. Any advanced capability demonstrated openly would be imitated, misunderstood, or misused. Humans adapt quickly but unevenly. Introducing advanced knowledge without the cultural framework to manage it responsibly leads to catastrophe. History already reflects this pattern repeatedly. The Anunnaki would not need to guess this, they would observe it. Human societies often collapse not from lack of knowledge, but from acquiring it too quickly without the structures to absorb it. Silence slows development to a survivable pace. It allows culture to evolve alongside technology rather than being overwhelmed by it. Guidance can be calibrated, revelation cannot. There is also the risk of violence directed outward. A revealed non-human presence would become a target. Fear breeds aggression. Even benevolent beings would be perceived as threats once their difference was undeniable. Humans would seek to contain, control, or destroy what they could not assimilate. Remaining unseen avoids provoking this instinct entirely. Familiarity breeds tolerance. Revelation reintroduces otherness. Silence also protects the integrity of human culture. Cultures need time to adapt ideas organically. Sudden shifts create backlash. The Anunnaki, if invested in long-term outcomes, would favour slow change over dramatic correction. Silence enables gradual influence. Speech invites abrupt reaction. Myths preserve memory without forcing confrontation. They allow ideas to exist at the edge of awareness. Humans can engage with them when ready. Revelation removes that choice. There is also a moral dimension. If humanity must mature, it must do so through its own decisions. Constant oversight infantilizes. Silence allows responsibility. Failure teaches. Growth follows struggle. The Anunnaki myths often emphasize restraint. Gods are powerful, but they do not fix everything. They allow suffering. They allow chaos. This is not indifference. It is recognition that intervention has consequences. Silence may also be a form of respect. Respect for human autonomy. Respect for cultural development. Respect for the unpredictability of life. To reveal everything is to dominate the narrative. To remain silent is to allow others to write it. Over time, silence becomes tradition. The gods are believed to be distant. Prayer replaces conversation. Ritual replaces instruction. Interpretation replaces dialogue. This shift stabilizes belief systems. Humans no longer expect answers. They find meaning instead. This stabilization allows civilizations to persist. It reduces dependency. It transforms divine presence from operational to symbolic. Symbols endure. Operators are challenged. The Anunnaki, by choosing silence, would avoid becoming tyrants of progress. They would avoid being frozen in history as rulers rather than facilitators. Silence allows them to fade from center stage without erasing their influence. Cultural collapse is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle. Belief systems erode. Trust dissolves. Identity fractures. Silence prevents this erosion by preserving the structures that give meaning. From a long-term perspective, silence is safer than truth. Truth demands action. Silence allows adaptation. This does not mean the Anunnaki cease to observe. Observation does not require speech. Watchfulness does not require presence. A quiet witness can still influence outcomes indirectly. Silence also creates mystery. Mystery preserves reverence. When answers are unavailable, meaning fills the gap. Humans are remarkably capable of sustaining belief without evidence. Revelation removes mystery and replaces it with disappointment. There is a final risk often overlooked. Once revealed, a presence cannot be unrevealed. Silence can be broken only once. After that, there is no return to invisibility. Every choice becomes irreversible. For beings concerned with continuity rather than dominance, this would be unacceptable. Silence preserves optionality. Revelation ends it. Seen this way, silence is not cowardice. It is stewardship. It is the recognition that not all truths are survivable at all times. As civilizations grew more complex, more interconnected, and more volatile, the cost of revelation would rise. Silence would become not merely preferable, but necessary. And so the Watchers remain quiet. Not because they are gone, not because they are afraid, but because they understand something humans often learn too late, that some knowledge, revealed too quickly, destroys what it seeks to enlighten. With silence chosen, presence becomes indirect, influence becomes subtle, memory becomes myth. The final consequence of this choice is not disappearance, but distance. A distance measured not in space, but in awareness. And yet, silence does not erase the future, it postpones it, which raises the last and most unsettling question of all. If silence was chosen to protect humanity once, what would it mean if circumstances changed? If the risks that demanded silence began to outweigh the risks of continued invisibility? That thought does not demand an answer. It simply lingers, quietly, as the story turns toward its final reflections. If some never left, then the past is not as distant as it appears. It is not sealed behind collapsed temples and unreadable tablets. It is threaded forward, woven quietly into the present, carried not as memory, but as continuity. This possibility does not require hidden cities, secret technologies, or dramatic interventions unfolding behind the scenes of modern life. It requires only patience, adaptation, and the long view. And when considered carefully, its implications for how we understand human history today are subtle, unsettling, and strangely ordinary. History is usually told as a sequence of transitions. Ages end, civilizations fall, gods withdraw, humanity takes the stage alone. This narrative comforts us because it draws a clear boundary between myth and modernity, between a world shaped by divine hands and one shaped by human effort. If some never left, that boundary softens. History becomes less of a clean break and more of a gradual handover, one that may still be incomplete. The first implication is continuity of influence. Many features of modern civilization appear not as sudden inventions, but as refinements of very old ideas. Law codes, calendars, property systems, symbolic architecture, ritualized governance, even abstract notions of order and progress. These did not emerge randomly. They appeared early, stabilized quickly, and then persisted with remarkable resilience across cultures and epochs. If advanced beings once shaped these frameworks and then withdrew from visibility rather than existence, the persistence of these structures becomes less mysterious. This does not mean that modern humans are guided, controlled, or monitored in any dramatic sense. It means that foundational assumptions may have been seeded long ago and allowed to evolve organically. Once embedded deeply enough, such assumptions no longer require reinforcement. They feel natural, self-evident, invisible. The most effective influence is the kind no one recognizes as influence at all. If some never left, then human progress may be less isolated than we assume. Not directed, but scaffolded. Humanity may have climbed its own ladder, but the ladder itself may not have been entirely self-constructed. This idea does not diminish human achievement, it reframes it. It suggests collaboration across time rather than dependency or manipulation. Another implication concerns the recurring patterns in human history. Cycles of growth, collapse, consolidation, and renewal appear again and again. Civilizations rise with shared features despite isolation. Writing systems emerge independently yet serve similar administrative purposes. Monumental architecture aligns with celestial cycles across continents. These patterns are often attributed to convergent development, and that explanation remains valid. But convergent development does not exclude shared influence. It simply does not require direct contact. If some never left, then convergence may not be purely coincidental. it may reflect common inheritance rather than independent discovery. Inherited frameworks tend to reappear even when details differ. The surface changes, the structure remains. Modern science itself reflects this continuity. The language of order, symmetry, law, and predictability echoes ancient cosmologies. The idea that the universe is governed by consistent principles is not self-evident. It is a belief, one that ancient cultures held long before empirical proof existed. If that belief was encouraged early, it would shape inquiry for millennia. Humans would look for order because they were taught to expect it. If some never left, then the persistence of this expectation takes on new significance. Science becomes not a rebellion against myth, but its refinement. The questions remain similar, only the methods change. There is also the question of absence. Modern history is marked by a sense of loss, a feeling that something meaningful receded, that the world became quieter, less enchanted, less guided. This sentiment appears in philosophy, literature, and religion across cultures. It is often framed as nostalgia for a golden age that never truly existed. But if some never left, then this feeling may reflect not disappearance, but distance. A shift from presence to background, from interaction to silence. In this view, modernity is not post-divine, it is post-conversational. The dialogue ended, the observation continued. Another implication concerns power and elites. Throughout history, certain families, institutions, and individuals repeatedly emerge at the centre of influence. This is usually explained through wealth accumulation, education, and social structures, and again these explanations remain valid. But if quiet integration occurred long ago, then continuity of influence may be deeper than economics alone. Cultural memory, inherited perspective, and long-term strategy could play a role alongside material advantage. This does not require secret knowledge passed in whispers. It requires orientation, a way of seeing time that stretches beyond a single lifetime, a preference for stability over spectacle. These traits are often observed among long-standing institutions. They plan slowly, they act cautiously, they prioritize continuity. Whether this is learned behavior or inherited disposition becomes difficult to separate. If some never left, then humanity today may not be watched in the sense of surveillance. It may be observed in the sense of stewardship. Observation does not imply intervention. It implies interest, attention, concern for outcome rather than control over process. This idea reframes many modern anxieties. Fears of hidden rulers, secret overlords, or concealed manipulators often reflect distrust of systems rather than evidence of non-human presence. If advanced beings were still here, deeply integrated, they would have no reason to rule overtly. History has already demonstrated that visible control is unstable. The most durable systems are those humans believe they own. The implication, then, is not domination, but restraint. If some never left, they have chosen not to shape modern civilization directly. That choice matters. It suggests confidence in human capacity rather than doubt. Silence becomes endorsement rather than abandonment. There is also the unsettling implication of responsibility. If humanity is no longer directly guided, then outcomes belong to humans alone. Environmental collapse, technological misuse, social fragmentation. These are not failures of oversight. They are consequences of autonomy. If some never left and still do not intervene, that silence may reflect a boundary, a decision to allow humanity to face the results of its choices. This perspective removes both comfort and fear. There is no savior waiting to correct mistakes. There is no hidden tyrant orchestrating events. There is only continuity, observation, and consequence. Modern technology introduces another dimension. Humanity is now capable of altering the planet, manipulating life, and reshaping information itself. These capabilities mirror, in limited form the kinds of influence once attributed to gods. If some never left, this moment would be significant not because it triggers revelation, but because it tests maturity. The measure is not capability, but restraint. History suggests that advanced influence withdraws when dependence becomes harmful. If humanity has reached a stage where it can cause irreversible damage, silence may be a form of ethical distance. Intervention would reintroduce dependency. Non-intervention forces accountability. There is also the question of memory reawakening. In recent centuries, interest in ancient myths, lost civilizations, and alternative histories has surged repeatedly. This is often dismissed as escapism or speculation, but it may also reflect cultural readiness. Societies revisit old stories when present narratives feel insufficient. Curiosity resurfaces when meaning erodes. If some never left, the re-emergence of these questions does not signal imminent revelation. It signals reflection. Humanity looking backward to understand itself rather than forward to be rescued. The most important implication may be psychological. If advanced beings lived among humans and then receded without leaving, humanity was trusted to continue alone. That trust, if real, carries weight. It reframes humanity not as a failed experiment, but as an ongoing one. Human history today, under this lens, is not evidence of abandonment or manipulation. It is evidence of freedom. Messy, imperfect, often painful freedom. The kind that cannot exist under constant guidance. If some never left, then they are not waiting for worship, obedience, or recognition. They are waiting for nothing at all. They are simply present, as the environment is present, observing outcomes rather than directing them. This idea also dissolves the obsession with proof. Proof is demanded when authority is questioned. Silence removes authority from the equation entirely. There is nothing to prove because nothing is being claimed. What remains is implication rather than assertion. A shift in how history is interpreted rather than rewritten. Ancient myths become memories filtered through time. Modern structures become inheritances rather than inventions. Humanity becomes participant rather than product. This does not demand belief. It does not require acceptance. It simply offers an alternative lens, one that neither elevates nor diminishes humanity, but situates it within a longer continuum. If some never left, then the question is not where they are, but whether it matters. Influence that does not interfere ceases to be influence in the conventional sense. It becomes context, and context rarely announces itself. It shapes quietly. As this thought settles, it does not demand conclusion. It resists finality. It leaves space for uncertainty, which is fitting. Because the idea of quiet coexistence, by its nature, does not resolve cleanly. It lingers. And in that lingering, one final reflection naturally arises, not about the past or the present, but about the feeling that remains when certainty dissolves and possibility takes its place. A quiet sense that some ideas refuse to be dismissed not because they are provable, but because they resonate in the spaces between what we know and what we assume. That feeling does not require answers. It simply accompanies us, gently, as the story slows and the mind begins to rest. As the mind begins to slow, certain ideas lose their sharp edges and become something softer, more persistent. They stop demanding proof and instead linger as impressions. This idea belongs to that category, not because it insists on belief, but because it refuses to dissolve completely. It settles into the background of thought, quiet but present, like a shape seen in low light that never fully resolves into certainty or illusion. The possibility that the Anunnaki, or beings like them, could have lived among humans without being seen for what they were does not unsettle because it suggests danger. It unsettles because it reframes familiarity. It invites the unsettling notion that the extraordinary does not always announce itself, and that what feels ordinary may carry deeper history than we are accustomed to noticing. Human comfort depends heavily on clear boundaries, past and present, myth and reality, us and them. When those boundaries blur, discomfort follows, not because something threatening appears, but because orientation is lost. The idea that ancient beings might have blended into human life quietly, leaving no clear line where myth ends and history begins, challenges the assumption that the world is neatly categorized. It suggests that the transition from guided beginnings to independent civilization may have been gradual rather than abrupt, and that some influences fade into context rather than disappear. This thought feels unsettling precisely because it does not demand action. There is no invasion narrative here, no imminent return, no revelation waiting behind a curtain. The idea offers no climax, no confrontation, no resolution. It simply suggests continuity. And continuity is difficult to process because it denies the comfort of endings. Humans are accustomed to stories that resolve. Heroes depart, gods ascend, ages conclude. These endings provide emotional closure. They allow the mind to rest. An unresolved presence, by contrast, remains open. It does not ask to be feared or worshipped. It simply exists as a possibility, and the mind does not know where to place it. The unsettling quality also arises from how plausible the mechanism feels once spectacle is removed. There's no need for advanced concealment or dramatic secrecy. Familiarity alone would suffice. Routine, proximity, time. These are forces humans understand well. We see how quickly the unusual becomes normal, how swiftly attention fades, how easily assumptions replace observation. Recognizing these patterns in ourselves makes the idea harder to dismiss. There is also a subtle shift in perspective that occurs when considering this possibility. History stops feeling like a closed book and begins to feel like a living system. The past is no longer safely distant. It becomes something that may still echo structurally rather than narratively. The influence is not something that can be pointed to. It is something that may be embedded in assumptions so basic they are rarely questioned. That realization is unsettling not because it suggests control, but because it suggests inheritance. Inherited frameworks are harder to challenge than imposed ones. They feel natural, they feel inevitable, they shape thought before thought becomes conscious. To realize that some of the ways humanity organizes time, authority, progress, and meaning may trace back further than recorded memory creates a quiet disorientation. Yet there is no menace in this idea. There is no implication of manipulation unfolding in the present. The unease comes instead from recognizing how little disruption would be required for such a coexistence to occur unnoticed. The mechanisms are human: forgetting, normalization, trust, projection. These are not exotic traits. They are everyday features of perception. The idea also lingers because it aligns with a recurring human intuition that something about the ancient world feels incomplete when viewed through purely material explanations. This does not negate archaeology, anthropology, or science. It simply acknowledges that human cultures consistently remember teachers, watchers, and originators who appear suddenly and then recede. These memories persist not because they are literal transcripts, but because they resonate with a sense of beginnings shaped by guidance rather than accident. The unsettling aspect lies in how this sense of guidance does not resolve into dependence. The beings do not stay to rule. They do not return to correct. They do not punish failure or reward success. They withdraw. They allow. They leave humans to struggle forward. That restraint feels unfamiliar. Human authority rarely behaves that way. If such beings existed, their absence from modern life would not signal abandonment or secrecy. It would signal confidence. Confidence that systems would endure. Confidence that humanity could adapt. Confidence that direct oversight was no longer necessary. This interpretation is unsettling because it removes both fear and comfort. There is no enemy to resist and no guardian to appeal to. The idea also unsettles because it denies the fantasy of revelation. There is nothing to uncover that would suddenly explain everything. No document, no artifact, no moment of collective realization. If quiet coexistence occurred, it would leave behind only ambiguity, traces too diffuse to prove and too consistent to dismiss entirely. Ambiguity is uncomfortable. Humans prefer certainty even when certainty is harsh. Uncertainty lingers. It cannot be resolved or ignored easily. It demands tolerance rather than belief. As the mind grows tired, this tolerance becomes easier. The need to resolve fades. The idea no longer feels like a puzzle to solve, but like a thought to sit beside. It does not compete with daily concerns. It simply adds depth to them. The streets feel older. Institutions feel layered. Traditions feel heavier, not with burden, but with time. The unsettling quality also softens into something quieter when considered without urgency. If advanced beings once lived among humans and then receded, their story is not one of dominance or failure. It is a story of transition, of stepping back rather than stepping away, of influence giving way to autonomy. That framing does not elevate humanity or diminish it. It places humanity within a longer arc, one that began with assistance and continued through independence. This arc mirrors many human experiences. Parents teach children, then withdraw. Teachers guide students, then allow them to fail and succeed alone. Influence fades, but presence does not need to continue for impact to remain. This parallel may be why the idea feels intuitively familiar. It mirrors patterns humans already understand emotionally. The discomfort arises not from strangeness, but from recognition. As sleep approaches, the mind becomes less defensive. It stops demanding categorization. In this state, the idea can exist without friction. It does not need to be labeled true or false. It can simply be possible. Possibility is less threatening than assertion. Possibility does not insist. It invites contemplation without pressure. It allows the mind to wander gently rather than confront. This is why the idea remains unsettlingly possible rather than disturbingly real. It never crosses the line into intrusion. It remains at the edge of awareness, where imagination and memory overlap, where myth and history blur softly rather than collide. The thought does not ask what would happen if they returned. It asks nothing at all. It simply observes that departure may not have been as complete as assumed, and that presence does not always look like presence. In this way, the idea aligns naturally with rest. It does not provoke action. It does not demand vigilance. It allows curiosity to dissolve into calm rather than sharpen into anxiety. The world remains unchanged by the thought. Streets are the same. People move through their lives unaware of deeper possibilities. Systems continue. Time passes. Nothing shifts outwardly. Only perspective deepens slightly, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. And perhaps that is why the idea lingers so quietly. It does not threaten identity. It does not rewrite history aggressively. It does not insist on belief. It simply offers a different way of seeing continuity, one that feels neither urgent nor alarming. As attention drifts and the day loosens its hold, the question of whether the Anunnaki ever truly left becomes less important than the atmosphere the question creates. A sense that the world may be older, more layered, and more patient than it appears. That not all influences announce themselves. That not all stories end cleanly. This sense does not disrupt sleep. It accompanies it. It allows the mind to settle without needing closure. And in that settling, the idea does what it has always done best. It remains quiet, unresolved, unthreatening. Present only as a possibility, resting at the edge of awareness, where certainty is no longer required, and the night is allowed to arrive gently without answers, without conclusions, and without disturbance.